The number 6 stayed in Nadia Harlow's head long after the probate hearing ended. Not the 6 figures her husband had earned every year for the last decade. Not the 6 bedrooms in the house she had been locked out of. Just 6. $6. The appraised value of the one asset the court had awarded her from a marriage of 11 years, from a life she had built brick by brick alongside a man who had apparently been building something else entirely, something she was never meant to find. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The tugboat sat at the far end of Slip 14 at Harrow's Point Marina, and it looked exactly like something worth $6. It was called the Clara Jean. 58 feet of rusted steel hull, a wheelhouse the color of old mustard, and a foredeck scattered with rope coils that had long since fused into shapes that resembled nothing useful. The name was painted on the stern in letters that had started out white and were now a chalky, flaking gray. One of the fendering tires hanging off the port side had cracked down the middle. The whole vessel sat slightly lower on the starboard bow, which either meant the ballast was off or something below the waterline was taking on water, and Nadia had no way of knowing which because she had never worked a boat in her life. She stood on the dock in November, wearing a coat that wasn't warm enough, holding a manila envelope she hadn't opened yet, and she stared at the Clara Jean the way a person stares at something they don't understand but can't look away from. The marina manager, a heavy-set man named Earl Diggs who smelled of diesel and sunflower seeds, had walked her down to the slip without saying much. When they stopped in front of the tugboat, he looked at it, then at her, then back at it. "You need anything," he said. "The pump-out station's at the far end. Harbor Master's open until 5. She had nodded like she knew what that meant. Nadia Harlow was 37 years old, and she had not always been the kind of woman who stood alone on cold docks with nothing. She had grown up in Macon, Georgia, the second daughter of a school librarian and a man who repaired HVAC units for small businesses. Her childhood was not wealthy, but it was steady. She'd worked her way through college, earned a hospitality management degree from Georgia State, and by 26, she was the assistant general manager of a boutique hotel in Savannah called the Whitmore House. She was good at her job. She was organized. She was calm under pressure. She had a way of solving problems before guests realized there was a problem to solve. She met Marcus Harlow at an industry conference in Atlanta in the spring of that same year. He was 34, broad-shouldered, quick to laugh, the kind of man who walked into rooms as if he had already been introduced. He ran a marine salvage and logistics company called Harlow Maritime, which operated out of Harrow's Point, a port town on the Alabama Gulf Coast about 60 miles from Mobile. He talked about the work the way people talk about things they genuinely love: the contracts, the cargo recoveries, the precision of pulling a sunken vessel up from 40 feet of water without losing a single piece. Nadia had never known anyone who worked with ships. She found the whole world of it fascinating in the way that anything unfamiliar becomes fascinating when described by someone who cares about it deeply. They married 14 months later. She left the Whitmore house, moved to Harrow's Point, and spent the better part of the next decade running the household and eventually the administrative side of Harlow Maritime, while Marcus handled operations and clients. They had no children, which had been a source of quiet grief for Nadia and what she later recognized as indifference for Marcus. They had a house on Magnolia Trace, a cream-colored colonial with a wide porch and 4 oak trees in the front yard. They had a good life, by every visible measure. Or she had thought they did. The signs, in hindsight, had arranged themselves in a line she should have been able to read. The phone calls Marcus took in the driveway. The business trips that extended by days without much explanation. The company accounts she was gradually eased out of managing, first the operating account, then payroll, then the contracts ledger, until she realized one afternoon that her login credentials had simply stopped working and Marcus had said, without quite looking at her, that the accountant had restructured the access protocols for liability reasons. She had believed him. She had believed most of what he told her because 11 years of marriage to a man who is mostly charming and occasionally affectionate will train you to fill the gaps in his explanations with the most generous interpretation available. Marcus Harlow disappeared on a Tuesday in late August. His boat, a 28-foot center console he used for personal fishing trips, was found adrift 12 miles off the coast, engine still running, no sign of him aboard. The Coast Guard searched for 4 days. They found nothing. The medical examiner's office, after the statutory waiting period and the formal declarations, ruled it a presumed drowning. His death certificate was issued on a Friday morning in October. Nadia had grieved. She had stood at a memorial service in the First Baptist Church of Harrows Point and received condolences from people who said things like, "He was one of a kind, and this town won't be the same." She had sat in the kitchen of her house on Magnolia Trace for 2 weeks barely eating. She had called her mother every night and cried until she didn't have anything left. Then the letters started arriving. The first was from a bank in Birmingham she had never heard of, a collection notice referencing a loan in Marcus's name and hers, co-signed for $340,000 that was now 3 months in arrears. The second was from the IRS. The third was from a law firm in Houston representing a company called Crestline Marine Holdings, which claimed that Harlow Maritime had defaulted on a contract and that Crestline was pursuing damages in excess of $1.2 million. Nadia had called Marcus's attorney, a man named Philip Jest who had handled the company's legal work for years, and asked him to explain what was happening. Philip had sounded genuinely uncomfortable on the phone. He told her she would need to retain her own counsel. She asked why. He said he couldn't represent both the estate and its creditors. She asked what he meant by creditors, plural, and he had gone quiet for a moment before saying that it would be better if she spoke with a lawyer. She hired one, a woman named Carolyn Briggs out of Mobile who charged $275 an hour and had a way of delivering catastrophic information in the same tone she might use to describe the weather. Carolyn spent 3 weeks pulling records, requesting documents, and making calls that Nadia was not privy to. Then she sat Nadia down in her office and told her what she had found. Marcus Harlow had spent the last 4 years systematically moving the assets of Harlow Maritime into a series of holding companies registered in Delaware and the Cayman Islands. The house on Magnolia Trace, which Nadia had believed was paid off, carried a second mortgage taken out 18 months ago. The company's 2 primary salvage vessels had been sold to a subsidiary of one of the holding companies for a fraction of their value. The business's client contracts, which had been the real engine of the company's income, had been quietly transferred. The operating accounts had been drained in a series of transactions, none individually large enough to trigger automatic review, spread across 14 months. Harlow Maritime, as a legal entity, was worth less than nothing. It had liabilities that dwarfed its remaining assets. "What's left?" Nadia had asked. Carolyn had slid a single sheet of paper across the desk. It itemized the remaining assets of the estate that had not been encumbered, transferred, or claimed by creditors. One item: the Clara Jean, a 1971 Moran-style harbor tugboat, appraised by a marine surveyor at $6 due to structural deterioration and the cost of deferred maintenance exceeding any reasonable estimate of the vessel's working value. $6, Nadia had said. $6, Carolyn confirmed. The creditors don't want it because it would cost more to dispose of it than they'd recover. So it passes to you as the surviving spouse. And everything else? Gone. Legally and completely. There had been a pause. Then Carolyn had set a second document on the desk, a smaller envelope, sealed with wax the color of old blood, Nadia's name written across it in handwriting she didn't recognize. This was found in the personal effects recovered from the drifting boat, Carolyn said. The Coast Guard logged it. It came to my office last week as part of the estate transfer documentation. Nadia had stared at the envelope. Whose handwriting is that? Not your husband's, as far as we can determine. She had taken the envelope home. She had sat with it on the kitchen table for 3 days without opening it, the same way you sometimes leave a door closed because you're not sure you're ready for what's on the other side. The foreclosure notice for the house came on a Thursday. She had 30 days. She opened the envelope on the Saturday after that. Inside were 2 things: a folded piece of paper and a small brass key on a tarnished ring. The note was written in the same careful, unfamiliar handwriting as the envelope. It said, "If you're reading this, then Marcus has done what I always feared he would. I am sorry. You were never supposed to be left holding nothing. The Clara Jean is not what it appears to be. Look at the keel plate in the forward, hold the one marked with an anchor stamp that faces port. The key opens what's behind it. What you find there will tell you more than I can safely write here. Trust no one in Harrows Point who ever profited from Marcus Harlow's company. There are more of them than you think." R. There was no other name. Just the letter R. And the key. Nadia had read the note 4 times. She had turned the key over in her fingers until the metal was warm from her skin. She had stood at her kitchen window and looked at the oak trees in the front yard that she would have to leave behind in less than a month, and something in her that had been collapsing for weeks went still. She had no plan. She had no money. She had nowhere to go. Not really. Her mother's house in Macon was a one-bedroom apartment that was already too small. Her sister's place in Nashville was full with 3 kids and a renovation, and she had no close friends left in Harrow's Point because 11 years of living as Marcus Harlow's wife had. She realized now, sorted her social world into people who were connected to him and people who had gradually drifted. But she had a boat, and apparently, it had a secret. The in-laws found out about the inheritance 3 days after the probate hearing. Marcus's mother, Nadia Harlow, was 64 years old, lived in a brick ranch house on the edge of town, and had never quite warmed to Nadia in the way that would have mattered. She arrived at Magnolia Trace with Marcus's brother, Terence, in a posture that suggested she believed grief was something best organized into proper categories of worthiness. "Philip tells me you got the tugboat," Donna said, sitting at Nadia's kitchen table with her hands folded. "That old thing from the yard." "Yes," Nadia said. "There's nothing on it worth keeping. Marcus used it for storage. Old rope, engine parts." Donna's eyes moved around the kitchen in a slow inventory. "It would be easier for everyone if you just let the marina dispose of it." Terence, who worked for a land-clearing company and had always treated Nadia with the politeness of someone who had been told to, added, "Donna's right. It's a liability. You'd be doing yourself a favor." Nadia had looked at them both and said, "I'll think about it." She had no intention of thinking about it. The Harlow family's reaction was only one version of what Harrow's Point had to say about Nadia's situation. Small towns metabolize other people's disasters quickly, and the story of Marcus Harlow's missing fortune had been the subject of considerable discussion at the hardware store, the diner on Camellia Street, and the 2 hair salons that served as the town's principal information exchanges. What emerged from that processing was a narrative that was both simpler and crueler than the truth. The prevailing version held that Nadia had been financially naive, that any woman who ran a company's books for 10 years and didn't notice what her husband was doing to its assets deserved what she got, and that the whole thing was probably not as surprising as it seemed to people who had known Marcus and always suspected he was a little too smooth. The woman who managed the title company had been particularly direct. Nadia had gone in to ask about the timeline on the house, whether there was any avenue to contest the second mortgage, and had sat across the desk from a woman named Brenda who had known Marcus since high school, and Brenda had looked at her over the rims of reading glasses and said, "Honey, a smart woman would have been keeping her own accounts separate the whole time. That's just sense." The mechanic at the marina, a man named Clyde Travers who chewed peppermint gum constantly and had serviced Harlow Maritime's vessels for years, put it differently when Nadia came to ask about the Clara Jean's engine condition. He walked around the tugboat once, kicked one of the hull ties, and said, "I'm not going to charge you for the consult because there's nothing to consult about. That thing's got a Gardner diesel that hasn't run since maybe 2018. Shaft seal's probably shot. If you were planning to live on it, I'd say you've had a rough go of things." He said the last part not unkindly, but the sentence contained its own verdict. The 2 women from her book club, the one social structure in Harrow's Point that had felt genuinely hers, had stopped calling after the first week. She understood. The situation was uncomfortable. There was nothing wrong with them individually. But when the life you've built turns out to have been constructed on someone else's fraud, the people adjacent to that life don't always know how to stay close to the wreckage. Nadia left the house on Magnolia Trace on a Wednesday in late November, with 2 suitcases, a box of books, a portable oil-filled heater she'd found at the Goodwill on Route 9, and a sleeping bag rated to 20 degrees that she'd bought online. She drove her 2019 Honda Pilot, which was in her name alone, bought before the restructuring, and therefore one of the few things Carolyn had confirmed was fully hers, down to slip 14 and parked at the end of the dock. She sat in the car for about 20 minutes watching the tugboat sit in the gray November water and considering the reality of what she was about to do. Then she picked up her suitcase and walked aboard. The Clara Jean smelled like rust and old fuel and something faintly organic, like bilge water that had been sitting long enough to develop its own ecosystem. The wheelhouse door was unlocked. The interior was dim, the windows brown with salt residue, and the chart table was buried under a loose pile of old marine maps, most of them of Gulf waters she recognized from her years in Harrow's Point. There was a bunk built into the port bulkhead, a narrow shelf with a thin mattress that she would need to replace, and beneath it, a cabinet that held 3 cans of motor oil and a flashlight with dead batteries. She found new batteries in the dollar section at the hardware store the next morning and spent the better part of her second day aboard, systematically going through every space she could access. She was not a boat person. She had not grown up on water. But she had spent 11 years managing a company that operated vessels, and she had the administrative mind of someone who understood inventory and documentation, which meant she knew how to make a thorough list of what existed and what didn't. The wheelhouse held the chart table, the helm with a wheel that still turned freely, a VHF radio that she had no idea how to operate, a compass binnacle, and a depth sounder that had been bolted to the overhead and was missing its display unit. Below the wheelhouse was a compact galley, a 2-burner propane stove, a small sink with no running water, and a refrigerator that hadn't been cold in years. Across from the galley was a head that she refused to think about until she had bleach. Behind the galley, down 4 steep steps, was the engine room, which was dark, loud in the way that spaces near water are always loud, and smelled heavily of diesel. She did not go into the engine room yet. She went forward instead, through a hatch at the bow end of the galley space, into the forward hold. The forward hold was the cargo space, low-ceilinged and wide, the original working heart of the boat, where a working tugboat would have stored equipment, lines, fenders, spare parts. What was in it now was a combination of actual harbor equipment and what Marcus had apparently used it for, which, as far as she could tell from initial inspection, was general storage of the kind that accumulates when someone has a space and no particular intention for it. There were 3 old life rings mounted on the bulkhead, 2 anchor chains coiled in the corner, a wooden crate that held bronze deck fittings still in their packaging, a rusting tool chest, several coils of braided polypropylene line, a folded tarp, a bench grinder bolted to a workbench along the starboard side, and the keel plate. She found it on the 3rd pass of the hold, sweeping her flashlight low along the port side hull plating. It was down near the floor, a section of heavier steel set slightly differently from the surrounding plates. And there, centered on it, was the anchor stamp the note had described. Not the manufacturer's stamp that would appear on normal hull plating. An individual stamp, pressed by hand into the steel, an old-fashioned Admiralty anchor with a ring at the top, the flukes pointing down. Facing port, just as the note said. Nadia crouched down in front of it, her knees on the cold steel deck, and examined the plate more carefully. It was bolted at the corners with 4 hex bolts that looked newer than everything around them. She ran her finger along the seam between the plate and the surrounding hull plating. The seam was tight, clean, sealed not with the factory sealing compound she'd seen elsewhere in the hold, but with something that had been applied more recently. A flexible marine sealant, the kind used for hatches and ports rather than structural plating. This plate had been put here after the boat was built, by someone who knew what they were doing. She sat back on her heels and stared at it. Then she took out the brass key and turned it over in her fingers. It was not a padlock key. It was longer, more complex, the kind of key that opened a cabinet lock or a drawer lock, something with tumblers rather than a simple shackle. She couldn't see anything on the keel plate that looked like a keyhole. She looked at the bolt heads again. They were standard hex bolts, but the centers of the bolt heads had been drilled out. Not the full depth, she could see the bottoms when she shone her flashlight on them, but drilled to a consistent depth. She tried the key in the first bolt head. Too small. Second bolt head. Too small. Third, the key sank in half an inch and stopped. She tried turning it. Nothing. Fourth bolt, the key went into its full length and turned. Something inside the plate made a sound. Not a loud sound. A soft internal click, like the mechanism releasing, the way a cabinet door sounds when the latch disengages. The plate did not fall open. It sat exactly as before. She pressed her palm against it and pushed. It gave not much, maybe a quarter inch, with resistance, the way a heavy door opens when the latch is clear but the hinges are stiff. She pushed harder, and the plate swung inward on a hidden hinge along its port edge, revealing not the inner hull structure she had expected, but a cavity. A space that should not have existed, built into the structure of the bow, larger than it had any reason to be. She shone her flashlight into it. If you're hooked on this story, Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The cavity was roughly 3 feet wide, 2 feet tall, and she couldn't immediately see how deep it went. The walls were lined with a dark rubberized material moisture barrier. She recognized it from renovation work done on the house years ago. Along the back wall, barely visible in the flashlight beam, were shelves. Not makeshift shelves. Proper fixed shelving, installed with care, the same rubberized material covering each surface. On the shelves were items wrapped in heavy plastic sheeting, sealed with tape that had yellowed with age. She could see shapes, but not contents. Rectangular packages, smaller boxes. One cylindrical tube she recognized as the kind used to store rolled documents. And on the lowest shelf, sitting unwrapped and in plain view, was a notebook. Dark green cover, spiral-bound. The kind sold in marine supply stores because they're waterproof and the pages don't tear when wet. She reached in and took the notebook. The cover had initials stamped into it with a small metal die. 2 letters, RV. She opened it to the first page. The handwriting was the same as the note. The same careful, slightly old-fashioned script, letters formed with the kind of deliberateness that suggested someone who had been taught penmanship and took it seriously. The first entry was dated 3 years ago, September 14th. M. does not know I found the secondary accounts. He believes I stopped asking questions after the Crestline filing. He is wrong. I have been documenting everything since March. This boat is the only place he does not look. He thinks it is worthless. That is the only advantage I have. Nadia read the sentence again. Then she looked at the initials on the cover. RV. She flipped through the notebook, scanning pages. There were entries spanning what appeared to be almost 3 years. Numbers, names, dates, account references, company names she didn't recognize, and interspersed throughout, written in the same careful hand, personal notes that weren't about money at all. One of them, near the middle of the notebook, read, "His wife does not deserve what is coming. I want her to understand that. I tried to leave her something. I don't know if it will reach her. I don't know how much time I have left." Nadia sat down on the cold deck of the forward hold with her back against the hull and the notebook in her hands and the flashlight propped against her knee. Outside, the marina was quiet. The water made its small, persistent sounds against the hull. The November wind pressed through the gaps in the forward hatch seal. She read the words again. His wife does not deserve what is coming. She thought about RV. She thought about the sealed wax on the envelope. She thought about the fact that the envelope had been found on Marcus's boat, the boat that had been found drifting, engine running, no body aboard. The boat from which Marcus Harlow had supposedly been lost at sea. A thought arrived in Nadia's mind with the particular clarity of something she had been trying not to think. If Marcus had faked his death, he would have needed help. He would have needed someone who knew his plans, who was close enough to the operation to understand the financials, who might have had reasons of their own to document what he was doing. And that person, whoever they were, had left a notebook on the Clara Jean. Not for Marcus to find. For Nadia. She looked at the plastic-wrapped packages on the shelves, still untouched, and she understood that whatever was in them, it wasn't something R.V. had left accidentally. Every object in that cavity was there on purpose. This was not a hiding place. This was a handoff. Someone had spent years building a case, and they had built it here, on a boat everyone agreed was worth nothing, because Marcus Harlow had taught everyone around him to look at the Clara Jean the way he wanted them to, as a wreck, as a liability, as something to be dismissed and eventually disposed of. He had been wrong about one thing. The boat was not worthless. He had also been wrong about something else. He had believed that the person building that case against him had no one to pass it to. He had believed he had isolated Nadia completely from any information that could threaten him. He had structured everything, the accounts, the transfers, the companies, the legal frameworks, to leave her with nothing useful, nothing that could be turned into a weapon. He had left her with a $6 tugboat. And inside that tugboat was 3 years of someone else's testimony. Nadia set the notebook down on the deck carefully. She picked up the flashlight and held it steady against the cavity opening and looked at each of the wrapped packages in turn. Then she took out her phone and opened a note. She began to write down everything she could see: dimensions, approximate quantities, the labels that were visible through the plastic on some of the smaller boxes. The third box from the left had a label in the same handwriting. 2 words. Account records. The The cylindrical tube had a single word written on the plastic wrapping in black marker. Proof. She wrote those down too. Then she sat for a moment with her phone in her hand. She thought about calling Carolyn Briggs. Then she thought about something the note had said. Trust no one in Harrow's Point who ever profited from Marcus Harlow's company. There are more of them than you think. Carolyn Briggs had been referred to her by Philip Jest, Marcus's attorney. She put the phone back in her pocket. She was not, she told herself, going to be naive twice. The Clara Jean creaked around her, settling on the tide, and Nadia stayed where she was on the cold deck of the forward hold for a long time, reading. The notebook's entries were not in chronological order. R.V. had clearly written in bursts when opportunity allowed, sometimes jumping back to add information to earlier entries, sometimes writing in a kind of shorthand that would need decoding. But a picture was forming with the steadiness of a photograph developing, shapes emerging from what had looked like nothing. Harlow Maritime had not simply been looted by Marcus. It had been part of something larger. The holding companies, the transfers they connected upward to a network of shell entities that R.V. had mapped in the back pages of the notebook in a diagram that filled 3 pages and used a system of numbers and initials that Nadia couldn't yet decode. But the names at the outer edges of the diagram were not the kind of names she expected. Not shell companies. Real companies. Companies with offices and employees and websites and reputations. One name appeared 3 times in the diagram, circled each time in red ink. Coastal Meridian Group. She knew that name. Coastal Meridian Group was the largest private marine logistics firm operating out of the Alabama Gulf Coast. They had offices in Mobile, Biloxi, and Panama City. They were, as far as anyone in Harrow's Point understood, a completely legitimate business with a long history of government contracts. Marcus had spoken of them occasionally over the years, not as a competitor, but in that oblique way he had when he didn't want to explain a relationship directly. Once, when she had asked whether Harlow Maritime would ever bid on the same federal contracts they did, he had said that Coastal Meridian was in a different category and that it was better not to think of them as competition. She had accepted that answer at the time. She looked at the names circled in red and thought about what it meant that a company in a different category appeared 3 times in a diagram of her husband's financial crimes. Outside, a foghorn sounded somewhere out in the channel. The marina lights came on automatically as the evening darkened, their reflection cutting orange stripes across the water through the porthole above the forward hatch. Nadia looked at the cavity in the hull, at the shelves of wrapped packages, at the notebook in her lap. She thought about the brass key, now in her coat pocket. She thought about the letter R and the initials R.V. and the sentence that she could not stop returning to. His wife does not deserve what is coming. Whoever R.V. was, they had known. They had known what Marcus was doing, and they had tried to leave a record of it, hidden in the one place he wouldn't look. They had addressed the envelope to Nadia. They had made sure, somehow, that it ended up in the official estate documentation where it would reach her. That meant they had known where Nadia would end up. They had known she would get the boat, which meant they had known Marcus's plans well enough to predict the outcome, which meant either they had been close to him, close enough to know the details of the estate disposition, or they had helped him plan it. And if they had helped him plan it, and then left evidence in the boat he was about to disappear from, then something had changed. Something had shifted their loyalty, or their fear, or their calculation of what was right. The notebook's last entry was dated 11 months ago, April 7th. I cannot stay. He knows I've been documenting. I got the last of the account records printed and sealed tonight. It's all on the boat. If I disappear after this, you'll know why. But I needed you, whoever finds this, to have what I couldn't keep safe anywhere else. I needed it to go somewhere he wouldn't reach. I hope I chose right. The entry ended there. The rest of the pages were blank. Nadia closed the notebook and held it against her chest in the dark of the forward hold, and she thought about the word disappear. She thought about how Marcus had used that word too. In a sense, disappeared from the boat, disappeared from his life, disappeared from the legal structures that would have eventually caught up with what he had been doing. She thought about what kind of person leaves evidence on a boat and then disappears. She thought about what kind of person is close enough to a fraudster to know the details of his plans and frightened enough to hide the documentation rather than take it to the authorities. She did not yet have enough information to answer those questions. But she had 3 years of handwritten entries, and she had a cavity full of sealed packages, and she had a brass key, and she had the one advantage she'd never expected. Marcus Harlow had wanted her to have nothing. He had architected it carefully. He had moved every asset, satisfied or evaded every creditor, structured every transfer to leave her legally whole and practically empty, with a boat worth $6 and no standing to challenge any of it. But he had made the assumption that every person in his life makes when they move through the world treating other people as scenery. He had assumed that no one was watching him closely enough to matter. He had assumed that whatever documentation existed was either under his control or safely destroyed. He had been wrong on both counts. Nadia got up from the deck, her knees stiff from the cold, and carried the notebook up through the forward hatch and through the galley and up into the wheelhouse. She sat in the helm seat, the one Marcus would have used when he moved this boat to and from the slip over the years, and she set the notebook on the chart table. She picked up the plastic-wrapped packages one by one from the shelves in the cavity and carried them forward and stacked them on the chart table next to the notebook. She left the cylindrical tube for last, setting it upright against the bulkhead. She counted the packages, 9 in total, plus the tube and the notebook. She sat in the wheelhouse of a $6 tugboat at slip 14 of Harrow's Point Marina on a cold November night, surrounded by 11 years of her life in ruins and the documented evidence of the man who had ruined it, and she made a decision. She was not going to be a woman who waited for someone to help her. She had done enough waiting. She had spent 11 years trusting a man who used that trust the way a skilled craftsman uses a good tool precisely, patiently, for his own purposes. She was not going to walk into another situation and hand someone else the problem to solve for her. She was going to understand this first. All of it. Every page, every account number, every company name, every entry in R.V.'s careful handwriting. She was going to understand it the way she understood a balance sheet or an operations ledger completely, until the numbers told a story she could stand behind. Then she would decide what to do. The fog had come in off the water while she sat there, and it pressed against the wheelhouse windows, muffling the dock sounds, making the world outside soft and indistinct. The Clara Jean rocked gently on a passing wake, and the chart table's contents shifted slightly, and a single photograph slid out from between the pages of the notebook and fell to the deck. Nadia picked it up. It was a photograph of a man and a woman standing on a dock she didn't recognize. The man was tall, mid-40s, wearing a dark jacket, his back half turned to the camera so that his face was only partly visible. The woman was shorter, maybe 30, with dark red hair and the composed expression of someone being careful. She was looking at the camera. The man was looking out at the water. On the back of the photograph, in R.V.'s handwriting, mobile, March 3rd. He doesn't know I took this. The man with him is the reason I started keeping records. Nadia looked at the man in the photograph for a long time. Then she looked at the woman, who had red hair and careful eyes, and had spent 3 years documenting something dangerous on a boat nobody wanted. She thought about the initials R.V. She thought about Mobile and Coastal Meridian Group and 3 red circles in a diagram. She thought about 11 months of silence since the last notebook entry. She set the photograph on the chart table next to the notebook. She pulled her coat tighter and reached over and turned on the small oil heater she had brought from home and set it on the deck beside the helm seat. Then she opened the notebook to the first entry and started reading from the beginning, slowly, not missing anything. Outside, the fog settled over Harrow's Point Marina, and the water went flat and the night held its breath. The Clara Jean sat at slip 14, worth $6 to everyone who looked at it. And inside it, the truth was waking up. She read for 3 hours straight. By the time she set the notebook down at close to midnight, the oil heater had warmed the wheelhouse to something livable, and her left hand was cramped from pressing the flashlight against her palm where the battery door kept sliding. She had gone through the notebook twice, once fast, to get the shape of it, and once slow, copying the key entries into her own notes app, building a timeline. What R.V. had documented was not a simple accounting fraud. It was layered, and the layers had been designed to look like legitimate business from every angle except the angle R.V. had been watching from. Here is what Nadia understood after those 3 hours. Harlow Maritime had been, for the last 7 years, a functional pass-through. Contracts came in, work was performed, payments were collected, but a portion of every major contract payment was routed through a series of invoices from subcontractors that did not, as far as R.V. could determine, actually exist. Those invoices were paid. The payments went into accounts that fed into the network of holding companies. From there, the money moved again, in smaller amounts, in directions R.V. had been able to trace only partially. The amounts were not small. R.V. had noted a conservative estimate in the margins of one page. Over the span of 7 years, something in the range of $4 to $6 million had passed through this structure. That money had not evaporated. Money in financial fraud cases rarely does. It moves until it finds somewhere stable to rest, and then it waits. R.V. had a theory about where it was resting. The theory appeared in fragments across multiple entries, never stated directly, always circling. The note in the diagram page was the clearest articulation. CMG holds the endpoint accounts. M thinks this is protection. He's wrong about what kind. CMG, Coastal Meridian Group. Nadia wrote that down and underlined it twice. There was something else in the notebook that she had circled in her own notes without fully understanding it yet. In an entry from 14 months ago, R.V. had written about a meeting between Marcus and someone described only as the man from CMG. The meeting had taken place in Mobile, at a restaurant near the port. R.V. had not been present but had received an account of it from whom. They did not say. What they wrote about the meeting was this: the agreement is changing. M does not see it yet. He believes he's still a partner. He is being repositioned. The boat, the death, the disappearance, this was not his idea alone. He thinks he is running the plan. He is the plan. He will not be a partner on the other side of this. He will be a liability. Nadia read that entry 4 times, each time understanding it a little more and not liking what she understood. If R.V. was right, Marcus had not simply decided one day to steal the company's assets and fake his death for a clean escape. He had been guided to that decision. Coastal Meridian Group or someone connected to them had helped architect the plan, had encouraged the asset transfers, had perhaps even financed some of it. And the purpose was not to help Marcus disappear comfortably. The purpose was to ensure that Marcus, once he was legally dead and beyond the reach of investigators, became someone who could be controlled, someone who could be silenced, someone who, if things went wrong, could not call a lawyer and walk into a courtroom and start explaining what he knew about CMG's finances. You couldn't testify if you were legally dead. You couldn't press charges. You couldn't recover assets. You had no legal identity, no standing, no protection. Marcus had thought he was outsmarting his own creditors, his own accountant, his own wife. He had walked straight into a trap that was much larger than anything he'd been running. Whether that trap was already closed around him, Nadia didn't know. She put that thought aside because it was too large to sit with for long, and she needed to keep moving. She opened the first of the plastic-wrapped packages. Inside the heavy plastic was a bundle of printed account statements, organized by date, held together with binder clips that had started to rust. The accounts were numbered, no names attached, but they corresponded to account numbers R.V. had referenced in the notebook, and Nadia matched them in a few minutes. These were the real records, the internal statements from the subcontractor accounts, showing money received from Harlow Maritime and then moved forward. The second package held printed email correspondence, dozens of pages, organized chronologically. The names in the email headers were in initials or partial names M.H., which she assumed was Marcus, and several she didn't yet recognize. But the content was detailed, operational, the kind of communication that happens between people who believe their exchange is private. One email chain, near the top of the pile, made her stop. It was dated 22 months ago. The sender was listed as R.C. The recipient was someone with the initials D.V. The subject line read, timeline confirmed. The body of the email said, she will not know until after. Make sure the boat is at the slip. The rest goes as discussed. R.C. 2 initials, not 2. R.V. had signed the notebook with a single initial. But this email was signed R, and the sender was R.C. She looked at the notebook cover again. R.V. The same careful handwriting. The same person, but a different last initial. People change their names. Women especially, and for all sorts of reasons. Or the V was not a last name at all. A middle initial, maybe. Or something else entirely. She wrote R.C. in her notes and put a question mark next to it. The fog pressed steadily against the wheelhouse windows. The marina was completely quiet by now, past midnight. Nothing moving on the docks. Somewhere across the water, a buoy bell rang in a slow rhythm, the same 3-second pause between each toll, measuring out the dark. Nadia became aware, without knowing precisely when it had started, that she was not the only person awake at Harrow's Point Marina. There was a light on the dock, not the sodium lamp on the pier post, which was always on. Something else, a smaller, moving light, the kind made by a flashlight or a phone screen. It was moving slowly along the dock, past the other slips, heading in the direction of slip 14. She clicked off her own flashlight. The wheelhouse went dark. She stayed in the helm seat and watched the light through the salt-fogged glass. It stopped at the slip before hers. She could just make out a shape, someone standing at the edge of the dock, the light pointing down at the water. Then the light turned and swept briefly upward, and in the moment before she pulled back from the window, she saw the silhouette of a person looking at the Clara Jean. Not walking past. Standing still. Looking. She stayed motionless in the dark for a long time. The light eventually moved again, back in the direction it had come from, and then it was gone. She waited another 10 minutes before she breathed fully. Then she picked up her phone and opened her camera roll and looked at the photograph she'd taken of the one page in the notebook. She hadn't been able to copy fast enough the diagram. The full web of company names and account numbers and initials, the 3 red circles around Coastal Meridian Group. She needed to understand every node in that diagram. She needed to understand who R.C. was. She needed to understand whether the person standing on the dock looking at her boat at midnight was connected to any of it, or whether they were just a marina neighbor with insomnia and a flashlight. She needed a lot of things she didn't have yet. Information, resources, allies she could trust, meaning allies who had no connection to Marcus, to Harlow Maritime, to Coastal Meridian, to Harrow's Point, and its comfortable network of people who had profited from her husband's dealings. She thought about that requirement and realized it narrowed the field considerably. The one person she could think of who might qualify was her sister in Nashville, Dana, who was a forensic accountant for a federal contractor and who had visited Harrow's Point exactly twice in 11 years because she had never liked Marcus and hadn't hidden it well. Dana, who had called Nadia after the probate hearing and said, in the blunt way she had, "Send me the financial documents. All of them. I don't care what Carolyn Briggs says about standing. I want to see the transfers." Nadia had told her there wasn't much to see. She had not yet known about the notebook. She opened her texts to Dana and typed, "Are you still willing to look at documents? I found something. It's more than I thought. I need your eyes on it before I decide how to move." She sent it even though it was after midnight and Dana had 3 kids, and Dana texted back 4 minutes later because Dana, apparently, also didn't sleep. "Send everything you have. Now. I've been waiting for this." Nadia looked around the wheelhouse at the stack of packages on the chart table, at the notebook, at the photograph of the man on the dock, and the red-haired woman with careful eyes. She photographed every page of the notebook. She photographed every document in the packages. She photographed the account statements and the email printouts and the diagram. She uploaded everything to a folder on Dana's secure work drive, the link her sister had sent years ago for sharing tax documents, because it was encrypted and because it lived on servers that had nothing to do with anyone in Alabama. While the uploads ran, she wrapped each package back in its plastic and carried them back down to the forward hold and returned them to the shelves behind the keel plate. She set the notebook among them. Then she swung the plate closed and turned the key in the 4th bolt head until the mechanism engaged. The cavity sealed as if it had never been there. She climbed back up to the wheelhouse and sat in the helm seat and looked at the chart table, which now held only the photograph and the brass key. She thought about R.C., who had known what Marcus was doing, who had spent 3 years building a case, who had sealed it inside a boat and addressed an envelope to a woman she had never met, and then had disappeared 11 months ago and not been heard from since. She thought about whether R.C. had disappeared the way Marcus had disappeared, by choice, by plan, safely hidden somewhere, or whether she had disappeared the way the notebook hinted Marcus was being positioned to disappear. Permanently, quietly, in a way that would never be connected to the right people. She thought about the light on the dock. The Clara Jean rocked gently on the water. The fog pressed against the glass. The buoy bell in the channel told its slow rhythm in the dark. Nadia Harlow, who had been handed nothing and told to be grateful for it, put the brass key in her coat pocket and the photograph in her bag, and she sat in the dim wheelhouse of a tugboat that everyone in Harrow's Point had written off as worthless, and she started to plan. She did not yet know how far this would reach. She did not know the name behind the initials, or who had been standing on the dock in the dark, or whether the woman with red hair was alive. She did not know what was on the other side of $4 to $6 million in moved money, or what Coastal Meridian Group would do if they learned what was sitting in the forward hold of the Clara Jean. What she knew was this: she was still here. She had lost the house and the company and the marriage and 11 years of a life built on a lie, and she was still here. She was cold and she was tired and she was starting over from a number that might as well have been zero. But she had the notebook. She had the documents. She had her sister's eyes on the evidence as of tonight. And she had a question burning at the center of everything that would not let her sleep. Marcus Harlow had faked his death to escape. The question was, where had he escaped to? And was he still there? Or had someone who was much better at this than Marcus already decided he was more useful gone? Nadia woke at 6 the next morning with her neck bent against the helm seat and the oil heater ticking beside her knee. The wheelhouse was cold at the edges where the heat hadn't reached the corners, the gap at the base of the door, the long windows with their inefficient seals. She sat up slowly and looked at her hands, which had grown stiff overnight, and at the chart table, which held nothing now except the photograph and the brass key and a coffee ring from a mug she barely remembered making. For a moment, coming out of sleep the way you do after 3 hours, she didn't know where she was. Then it settled: the boat smell, the gentle movement, the sound of the marina waking up outside, distant engine sounds, and the lap of water against and she remembered everything. She got up, used the head, which was functional if terrible, and went to the galley. She had bought supplies 2 days before moving aboard: instant coffee, a box of oatmeal, a loaf of bread, peanut butter, 2 apples. She made coffee on the propane burner and stood in the galley with the mug in both hands and looked out the small porthole at the dock. The dock was empty. Whatever light she had seen the night before was long gone. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Dana called at 7:43, which in Nashville meant she had already sent the kids to school, made her own coffee, and spent 40 minutes looking at what Nadia had sent. Her voice had the particular quality it got when she was working flat effect: precise, the emotion stripped out to make room for the information. I looked at the account statements first, she said. The ones are V, labeled by year. You want the bottom line? I want all of it, Nadia said. But start with the bottom line. The bottom line is that whoever built this document set knew exactly what they were doing. The account structure your husband used is not amateur hour. These are properly registered entities with real EINs, real registered agents, legitimate-looking compliance filings. Someone with professional knowledge helped design this. Not Marcus. R.V. suggests it was Coastal Meridian Group. That tracks with what I'm seeing. Some of the wire routing in the later statements, the ones from the last 2 years' routes, through a correspondent bank that CMG uses for international transfers. That's not definitive, but it's not nothing. Nadia set her coffee down. How much money are we talking about, Dana? Total. Best estimate from what I can document so far. Between $4.8 and $5.2 million moved out of Harlow Maritime over 7 years. That's the conservative number. A pause. But there's a complication. Tell me. About 18 months ago, the routing changes. The subcontractor accounts the ones that were receiving from Harlow Maritime, and then pushing money forward they go dark. No more incoming, no more outgoing. They're just sitting there, zeroed out. But the money doesn't stop. It just moves differently. I can see the outflows from Harlow Maritime continuing, but I lose the trail at the next hop. Whatever account received the money in that last period, I can't see it in what you sent me. It's not in these records. Meaning R.V. didn't have access to the final destination, or couldn't document it. Either they got cut off from that part of the system, or whoever was running the endpoint started taking more precautions. But here's the thing, Nadia. The outflows from Harlow Maritime don't stop 18 months ago. They accelerate. The last 6 months before Marcus's disappearance, the pace of transfers increased significantly. We're talking about money moving fast and quiet right up until the week he went overboard. Nadia thought about R.V.'s notebook entry. The agreement is changing. He thinks he's running the plan. He is the plan. Someone was cleaning house, she said. Looks like it. getting the last of the money out before the vehicle, meaning the company, became useless. Once Marcus disappeared and the death certificate processed, Harlow Maritime would have no active principal. All its accounts would be frozen pending estate proceedings, and the creditors would move in. Anyone who wanted to keep pulling from that structure had a hard deadline: Marcus's disappearance. And they hit that deadline, right down to the wire. Dana's voice shifted slightly. "I want to talk to you about something else. The photograph you sent, the one from the notebook." Nadia had photographed and uploaded the picture of the man and the woman on the dock. "What about it?" "I ran the man through a reverse image search. No results, which means he's either very private or very careful about what images of him exist publicly. But the dock in the background, I looked at it. The dock fittings, the type of bollards, the signage on the building at the right edge of the frame. That's not Harrow's Point Marina. RV, wrote Mobile on the back. Yes, but more specifically, I think that's the Port of Mobile Commercial Pier, the private berth section used by logistics companies. CMG has a registered berth there. I can't confirm from the photo alone, but the architecture matches what I found on their website." Nadia wrote this down. "One more thing," Dana said, "and this one I want you to sit down for if you're not already." "I'm sitting." "I ran the initials R, V, and R, C against the public record. Property records, court filings, business registrations, anything accessible. I was looking for someone with those initials who had a connection to either Harlow Maritime or Coastal Meridian." A brief pause. "I found a woman named Rosa Calloway. Goes by Rosa Calloway professionally. She worked as a financial controller at Coastal Meridian Group from 2014 to 2023. She filed a change of address with the Alabama Secretary of State for a small consulting LLC she owned in March of last year." Nadia felt something go quiet and alert inside her. "And after March? I can't find anything. No employment records, no new filings, no updated addresses. The LLC went inactive for failure to file its annual report. Her Alabama driver's license expired in August of last year and was not renewed. Her phone number, which I found in an old professional directory, has been disconnected since approximately the same time. 11 months ago, exactly when R.V.'s notebook entries stopped." "She's the one," Nadia said. "She's the one," Dana agreed. R.V. and R.C. are the same person. Rosa Calloway. She worked inside CMG. She saw what was happening. She documented it over 3 years, using your husband's boat as her archive, and then she disappeared." Nadia sat with that for a moment. The boat moved slightly under her, a deep, slow roll from the wake of something large passing in the channel. "Do you think she's alive, Dana?" Her sister was quiet for several seconds. "I don't know. I genuinely don't know. I hope so. But Nadia, I need you to understand something. Whatever Rosa Calloway was afraid of was real enough that she chose to document things in secret over 3 years rather than take them to the authorities. She had professional access. She understood financial crime. She knew what she was looking at. And she was still scared enough to hide everything on a tugboat in a marina instead of walking into an FBI field office. She said in the notebook she didn't trust the local authorities. She thought Marcus had connections. CMG has connections, Dana said bluntly. Federal contracts, lobbyists, a board of directors that reads like an alumni directory for the state government. Someone with that kind of reach, you don't walk into a county sheriff's office and hand them a notebook. You'd be dead in the water before the week was out. So what do? You don't do anything visibly. Not yet. I'm going to spend the next few days reconstructing the full financial trail with what you've sent me. If I can document the end destination where that last wave of money actually landed, then we have something we can take directly to the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit in Washington. Not the mobile field office, not the state AG. Federal, above the level where CMG's reach is less reliable. A pause. Can you stay safe where you are for a few days? Nadia looked around the wheelhouse of the Clara Jean and considered the question from multiple angles. Safe was relative. She had no home. She had $6 in theoretical assets and a few hundred real dollars in a checking account. She had a boat that nobody wanted to steal and a hidden cavity full of documents that someone, somewhere, was probably already thinking about. I'll manage, she said. She spent the rest of the morning at the Harrows Point Public Library because the marina's Wi-Fi was unreliable and she wanted a public IP address for her research rather than a signal that could be traced to slip 14. She took a table in the back corner near the local history section and worked steadily for 3 hours. What she was looking for was anything public about Coastal Meridian Group that might corroborate what Rosa Calloway had documented. The company's website was professional and minimal, the kind of corporate presence designed to convey legitimacy without revealing anything useful. They described themselves as providing marine logistics, cargo coordination, and port operations management. They listed their federal contracts on a separate government contracting database, 16 active contracts with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, 4 with the Navy's Fleet Logistics Command, and 2 with the Department of Homeland Security's Port Operations Division. Total contract value across all active agreements, approximately $180 million. That number stopped her. She read it twice. $180 million in federal contracts. That was the machine Nadia was looking at, not the $4 to $5 million that had passed through Harlow Maritime's accounts, but a company with $180 million in government business that used a small marine salvage operation in a Gulf Coast town as one of its financial instruments. She searched the names on CMG's board of directors. There were 7 of them. She wrote all 7 names down. One she recognized immediately, Thomas Pruitt Alcott, who had served 2 terms as Alabama's state comptroller before moving into private consulting. She searched him separately and found his name in 14 different business filings over the last decade, most of them connected to companies with marine or logistics operations in the Gulf region. Another board member was listed simply as G.W. Landers, with no additional biography provided on the website. She searched the names separately. Very little came up: a business registration in the Cayman Islands for a holding company, a single mention in a 2018 trade publication about Gulf port operations. No photograph, no professional history. She was writing down the Cayman Islands registration number when someone sat down across from her at the table. She looked up. The man was in his early 40s, with the kind of face that was forgettable by design: regular features, neutral expression, the sort of person you would have trouble describing accurately an hour after meeting him. He wore a jacket the color of charcoal and carried a leather notebook that he set on the table between them without opening it. "Mrs. Harlow," he said. His voice was conversational, pitched low, the way people speak in libraries. "Ms.," she said, because she had started using her maiden name, Nadia Voss, the week after the probate hearing. She hadn't corrected anyone in Harrow's Point because there was no point to it. She corrected this man because something about his phrasing put her on alert. "Ms. Voss," he said, the adjustment immediate and smooth. "I'm sorry to interrupt your research. My name is Garrett Webb. I work for a maritime insurance firm called Haller & Risk Associates out of Mobile. We carry policies on several vessels in this marina and in the surrounding area, and we've been conducting a routine review of the Harlow Maritime estate in connection with our policy on the Clara Jean." He placed a business card on the table. She looked at it without touching it. The card was high-quality thick stock, raised lettering, a logo that looked expensive. Haller & Risk Associates. An address in Mobile. "What kind of review?" she asked. "Standard estate review for a vessel with an inactive policy. When the policyholder is listed as deceased and the vessel transfers to a new owner, we have a 30-day window to either renew the policy under the new owner or void it for non-continuation. The Clara Jean's window is closing at the end of next week." He opened his notebook and uncapped a pen. "I just need to confirm a few details about your plans for the vessel." "My plans," Nadia said. "Whether you intend to operate it commercially, keep it as a private vessel, or put it up for sale. Standard questions. It determines whether we'd extend coverage." She looked at him. The questions were routine. The framing was routine. His effect was routine. Everything about this interaction was calibrated to feel like something that happened every day. But no one had contacted her about the Clara Jean's insurance since the probate hearing. The estate's insurance correspondence had been handled by Carolyn Briggs, and Carolyn had never mentioned an active policy on the tugboat. In fact, Carolyn had specifically noted that the vessel's insurance had lapsed more than a year before Marcus's disappearance, which was part of why its appraised value was so low. An uninsured vessel in its condition couldn't be sailed, sold, or used without significant investment. An insurance policy that had lapsed could not currently be under review. "I haven't decided yet," she said evenly. "I'll have my attorney contact your office once I've made those decisions." "Of course." He wrote something in his notebook. "Have you had a chance to do a full inspection of the vessel?" Any concerns with its current condition? The question was framed as professional courtesy. The specificity of it was not. Not yet, she said. Of course, these older vessels can be surprising. Sometimes what appears to be deferred maintenance conceals. He paused just long enough to make the pause feel natural, structural concerns that aren't visible from the exterior. She held his gaze and said nothing. He smiled. It reached his eyes just enough to seem practiced. We'll look for your attorney's contact. Here's our direct line if it's easier. He tapped the card on the table. Then he stood, tucked his notebook under his arm, and walked toward the front of the library with the unhurried pace of someone who had accomplished what they came for. Nadia did not watch him go. She looked at her notes and counted slowly to 30. Then she took out her phone and searched Halloran Risk Associates, Mobile, Alabama. No results. She tried the phone number on the card. It rang 4 times and connected to a generic voicemail with no company name. Just a beep. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. She sat in the library for another 20 minutes, not doing any more research, just thinking. Then she gathered her notes, put her laptop in her bag, and walked out into the pale December afternoon. She did not go directly back to the marina. She drove instead to the county clerk's office on Merchant Street, which handled vessel registration records for the counties. Registered watercraft. She had been meaning to check the Clara Jean's ownership history and had not gotten to it yet. She went now. The records clerk, a young woman named Sherry, pulled the Clara Jean's registration history on her terminal and printed 3 pages. Nadia took them to a bench in the hallway and read through them. The Clara Jean had been built in 1971 at a shipyard in Pascagoula. Its first registered owner was a Gulf Coast towing operation called Morrison Tug and Barge, which had operated it as a working harbor tug for almost 20 years. In 1989, it was sold to a private individual. In 1994, to another private buyer. In 2003, it was purchased by a woman named Rosa Calloway, with an address in Mobile. Rosa Calloway had owned the Clara Jean for 9 years. In 2012, she had sold it to Harlow Maritime, LLC. Price listed on the bill of sale, $1. Nadia read that line 3 times. $1. The same transaction structure used for property transfers that are not actually sales when you are giving something to someone or moving something between entities you control, but a dollar amount is required by law. Rosa Calloway had transferred the Clara Jean to Marcus Harlow for $1. That was not the transaction of a stranger selling a boat she no longer needed. That was deliberate. That was a choice made with purpose. She thought about what that meant. Rosa Calloway had owned this boat for 9 years before giving it to Marcus. She would have known every corner of it. She would have known the forward hold, the hull plates, the spaces that looked structural but weren't. She would have built the hidden cavity herself, or had it built, before the boat changed hands. She had given Marcus the Clara Jean knowing it contained a space he would never look for. And then she had spent the next 11 years working inside the company CMG that she had apparently been documenting all along, adding evidence to a hidden archive in the hull of a boat that was technically registered to someone else. Why? Why not take the documentation and walk away? Why stay inside the organization for more than a decade? Nadia thought about Rosa's notebook entry, the one she had committed almost to memory. I cannot stay. He knows I've been documenting. Not, I've done enough. Not, I'm ready to leave. He knows. She hadn't left CMG by choice. She had left because she had been found out. The question that settled in Nadia's chest was cold and specific. What happened to people at Coastal Meridian Group who were found to have been documenting its operations? She drove back to the marina through the late afternoon, the sun dropping behind the tree line that edged the parking lot, the air carrying that particular December smell of salt and wood smoke. She parked and walked down the dock to slip 14. The Clara Jean sat as she had left it. Almost. The wheelhouse door was not fully latched. She had latched it that morning. She was certain of it. She had checked it twice because the latch was stiff and you had to lift the handle slightly before pressing it flush. The door was now sitting a 1/4 inch proud of the frame, the latch not caught. She stood on the dock looking at it for a moment. Then she stepped aboard as quietly as she could and stood still on the foredeck, listening. The boat was silent. She moved through the wheelhouse, nothing obviously disturbed. Chart table as she'd left it, the photograph and key still there. Down to the galley. Her food supplies in order, the 2 suitcases she'd stored under the bunk untouched. She checked the head, the engine room access hatch which she kept padlocked and which was still padlocked, and then went forward to the hold. The hold looked exactly as it always did. Life rings on the bulkhead, anchor chains in the corner, tool chest. She crouched down and examined the keel plate. The hex bolts were in their positions, the sealant along the edge undisturbed. Whoever had been inside the Clara Jean had been looking but hadn't found what they were looking for. She leaned her back against the hull and breathed. She thought about Garrett Webb and his routine questions about structural concerns. She thought about how quickly he had shown up after Dana uploaded the scanned documents last night, which could be coincidence, or could mean that someone who monitored the marina's activity or who tracked certain digital searches had noticed something. She thought about the light on the dock at midnight. Garrett Webb was not an insurance investigator. He was someone's advance team, which meant someone already knew she had been looking at the boat's contents. The question was whether they knew what she had found, or whether they were still guessing. The keel plate cavity had not been touched, which meant either they hadn't known specifically what to look for, or they hadn't had enough time, or the sealed plate had been convincing enough to pass a casual search. She needed to move faster. She went back to the wheelhouse, sat at the chart table, and called Dana. Someone was in the boat today while I was out. Tell me. She described the wheelhouse door and the hold inspection. She described Garrett Webb at the library. Dana was quiet for a moment. Did you find anything useful in the county records before he interrupted you? The Clara Jean's ownership history. Rosa Calloway owned it for 9 years before transferring it to Marcus for $1 in 2012. A long pause. She built the archive before she handed him the boat. That's what I think. That means she was planning this from at least 2012. Maybe longer. She was inside CMG from 2014. Maybe the boat was always meant to be a repository, even before she knew exactly what she'd be. Documenting. Okay, Dana said. Here's what I've found since this morning, and I need you to hear all of it. The financial trail I was trying to reconstruct, I found the endpoint. I found where the last wave of transfers landed. Nadia pressed the phone harder against her ear. Tell me. There are 2 accounts, both registered offshore, both using nominee structures to obscure the beneficial owners. One is in the Cayman Islands under a registered entity called Blue Water Holdings, Limited. The other is in Belize under a shell called Meridian Pacific Corporation. Dana's voice was steady and careful. Blue Water Holdings is connected to CMG. I can document that through the correspondent banking pathway and through a cross-reference with a Delaware holding company that appears in both CMG's older SEC filings and the Blue Water registration documents. What about Meridian Pacific? Meridian Pacific is the interesting one. It doesn't appear in any of Rosa's documentation. The name isn't in the notebook, isn't in any of the account records you photographed. Either she didn't know about it, or it was created after she started her investigation and she never encountered it. Whose entity is it? I can't tell from the registration alone. The beneficial owner is shielded through 2 layers of nominee director structures. But here's what I can tell you. A pause that had weight in it. Meridian Pacific received a wire transfer 4 months after Marcus Harlow's death certificate was issued. The transfer originated from a correspondent account in the Bahamas. The amount was $2. $3 million. Nadia's hand went still on the table. After his death, she said. After his legal death. The source account is a private banking account at a firm in Nassau. I can't see the account holder from public records. But Nadia, that account was opened 11 months before Marcus disappeared. It was opened in the name of a trust registered in the Bahamas. What's the trust called? It's called the Meridian Cross Trust. Dana's voice was even. The trustees are listed as 2 nominee companies. But the trust's registered correspondence address, the address on file with the Bahamian Registry, is a private mail service in Nassau that is also used as the correspondence address for at least 14 other trusts and entities. 11 of those entities have names that include some variation of the words meridian, cross, or maritime. Nadia sat in the stillness of the wheelhouse and let that connect itself. Marcus set up that trust while he was still alive, she said. While he was still technically here. Before he disappeared. Before the transfers accelerated. Before everything went dark in Harlow Maritime's books. And that account sent $2.3 million to a Belize shell company 4 months after his death. Which means, Dana said, that someone with access to the Meridian Cross Trust executed a transaction after Marcus was legally dead. Either Marcus himself executed it from wherever he is using an identity that, as far as the law is concerned, no longer exists, or someone else had access to that trust and moved the money on his behalf. Either way, Nadia said slowly, he's not dead. No, Dana said. He is not dead. The Clara Jean rocked gently. Outside, the marina had gone quiet in the way it went quiet after the last of the day workers left, the slip lights coming on in sequence down the dock, their orange glow catching the water and breaking it into small moving pieces. Nadia thought about Marcus. Not the abstract fraud, not the transfers and the holding company's Marcus. The man who had handed her a glass of wine on their third date and said something about the way the Savannah River looked at dusk that she had found inexplicably moving. The man who had held her hand at her father's funeral and said almost nothing, which had been exactly right. The man who had, for years and years, been the person she measured everything else against. He was somewhere warm, she thought. She had no evidence for this, but it was what she believed. He had planned for years, and he had gone somewhere deliberately chosen. He had not suffered. He had not panicked. He had executed a plan with the same precision he brought to a salvage operation, and he was somewhere, right now, living on someone else's money in a place that did not require him to remember that she existed. She pressed her palm flat on the chart table. Dana, she said, I need to know if that account is still active. I know you do. That's what I've been trying to determine. I can't see account activity directly, I don't have that kind of access. But I can see something adjacent to it. The registered correspondence address for the Meridian Cross Trust has received at least one piece of formal notice correspondence in the last 90 days. I can see the notice in the Bahamian official registry, which is public record. The notice was related to annual fee collection for the trust. The trust did not lapse. It's current. Current as of when? Current as of 3 weeks ago. The fee was paid. 3 weeks ago. Marcus Harlow had been legally dead for 7 months. And 3 weeks ago, someone had paid the annual fees on the trust he had built to hold his stolen fortune. He was alive. He was operational. He was still moving money. And he had no idea that a woman he had written off as collateral, his wife, the one he had left with a $6 boat and a pile of ruined credit, had spent the last week reading 3 years of Rosa Calloway's testimony in the hull of that boat, and now had a forensic accountant sister in Nashville who was building a documented case that could reach him wherever he had gone. Nadia sat in the helm seat and looked at the cylindrical tube she had brought up from the cavity and set in the corner of the wheelhouse 2 days ago and not yet opened. She had saved it because it was the one item Rosa had labeled proof, and she had wanted to understand everything else first before she looked at what Rosa considered the most important piece. She got up and picked it up. It was sealed at both ends with rubber caps, the kind used to protect architectural drawings in transit. She pulled the first cap off. Inside was a rolled document, protected by a layer of archival tissue paper. She unrolled it carefully on the chart table and weighted the corners with her coffee mug and her phone and the brass key. It was not a nautical chart, as she had half expected. It was a printed document, perhaps 40 pages, held together by a binder clip, rolled rather than folded. The first page was a cover sheet with a title typed in plain lettering, Declaration of Rosa Vance Calloway. Prepared as a sworn statement for submission to the Federal Bureau of Investigation Financial Crimes Unit, Washington, D.C., dated October 12th. No year, just the month and day. It would have been prepared before Rosa disappeared. Below the title, in Rosa's handwriting, a note. If I never get to deliver this in person, the person holding this document should know. I tried to go through proper channels twice. The first attempt was intercepted. The second resulted in a meeting that convinced me the mobile field office was not safe for this submission. This document and the corresponding evidence archive in the Clara Jean's forward hold represent the complete record of what I witnessed and documented over 9 years at Coastal Meridian Group. The archive is not complete. The final transfer routing was not accessible to me, but it is sufficient. Use it. 9 years. Not the 3 years reflected in the notebook entries. Rosa had been watching and recording since her first year at CMG. Nadia turned to the second page. The declaration was detailed in the way that only someone with Rosa's background could make it. Detailed financial figures cross-referenced to account numbers, dates tied to specific transactions, names connected to specific decisions. The prose was careful and precise, the language of someone who knew what was needed for a legal submission. The first 12 pages covered Coastal Meridian Group's internal financial structure and the pattern of fraudulent invoicing that had been running since before Rosa joined the company. The company had been double-billing federal contracts systematically, inflating operational cost reporting, and using the excess to fund the offshore accounts Dana had already begun to map. The scale of it was not $4 to $5 million. The scale of it, as Rosa documented it across 12 pages with specific citation to contract numbers and billing submissions, was closer to $60 million over 9 years. $60 million. Harlow Maritime had been one of many instruments a small, regional operator used as a pass-through entity because its size and its location made it easy to audit-proof. Marcus had not been the architect of anything. He had been recruited, paid well enough to cooperate, and eventually positioned for disposal when his usefulness expired. Nadia sat back from the document and looked at the ceiling of the wheelhouse. She thought about Donna Harlow, sitting at her kitchen table with her arms folded, telling her to let the marina dispose of the tugboat. She thought about Terrence saying it was a liability. She thought about Philip just recommending Carolyn Briggs. She thought about the light on the dock at midnight, and Garrett Webb's carefully constructed questions about structural concerns, and the wheelhouse door she had found unlatched. She thought about all the ways that the people connected to Marcus Harlow's world had arranged themselves, knowingly or not, to ensure that she walked away with nothing and asked no questions. She was still reading at 10 that night when her phone buzzed with a text from Dana. Not a call, a text, which meant Dana was being careful about what she said over a voice line. I found G.W. Landers, CMG board member with no biography. Full name is Gregory Winston Landers. He is currently the registered agent for 7 Cayman Islands entities, including Blue Water Holdings. He is also listed in the Bahamian Registry as a trustee nominee for 11 trusts. One of those 11 trusts is the Meridian Cross Trust. Nadia stared at her phone. Gregory Winston Landers, a CMG board member, was listed as a nominee trustee for the trust Marcus had used to hold his exit funds. A member of the company's board had a documented connection to the account that had been active 3 weeks ago. This was not a man who had helped Marcus disappear for Marcus's benefit. This was a man who had helped design the cage that Marcus was now living in. She typed back, "Can we connect Landers to the money that's moved since Marcus's death?" Dana's reply took 4 minutes. "Working on it. Also, I've been careful, but I want you to be aware. Some of the public record searches I've run in the last 24 hours may be visible to a sophisticated monitoring system. I've been routing through a VPN, but if CMG has the kind of reach these contracts suggest, they may have someone watching for certain search patterns." Nadia thought about Garrett Webb, about how quickly he had appeared after she started looking. She typed, "Someone was already in the boat today. They didn't find the evidence. But they know I'm looking." Dana's response was immediate. "Then we're on a clock. I need 48 more hours to build this properly. Can you stay safe for 48 hours? She looked at the declaration in front of her. At Rosa's name on the cover page. At 40 pages of 9 years of documented evidence, prepared by a woman who had vanished trying to bring it to light. She picked up the brass key and turned it over in her fingers, feeling the warm metal, the specific weight of it. "Yes," she typed back. "I can stay safe." But she was not. She understood now. Going to stay quiet. Whatever window existed, whatever 48 hours were available before Garrett Webb or the person who sent him found a way to make this harder, she was going to use every hour of it. She rolled Rosa's declaration back carefully and returned it to the protective tube. She capped both ends. She went down to the forward hold and opened the keel plate and placed the tube back on the shelf with the other packages. She sealed the plate. Then she came back up, made herself more coffee, and sat in the helm seat in the dark wheelhouse with the photograph of Rosa Calloway on the chart table in front of her. Rosa had carefully green eyes and dark red hair, and the composed expression of someone being watched. She had owned this boat for 9 years. She had known every corner of it. She had built a hidden space in its hull and spent almost a decade filling it with the truth, and she had trusted that truth to reach someone who would know what to do with it. She had addressed the envelope to Nadia, not to anyone official, not to a law firm or a federal agency. To Nadia, a woman she had never met, the wife of a man she had watched and documented and ultimately tried to warn. Why Nadia? She thought about it for a long time. She thought about Rosa's notebook entry. His wife does not deserve what is coming. I want her to understand that. Rosa had watched Marcus Harlow for years. She had watched him run a fraud, watched him be recruited by people more dangerous than himself, watched him agree to a plan that would make him legally untraceable and practically imprisoned dependent on people who could expose him the moment he became inconvenient. She had watched all of this from inside CMG, with access Marcus didn't know she had, and she had documented it all. At some point, she had started thinking about Nadia, not as a strategy, as something else. As the one genuinely innocent person in the entire picture, the woman standing in the middle of a financial crime she hadn't committed and a marriage built on sustained deception, about to lose everything through no fault of her own. Rosa had left the evidence for Nadia because Nadia was the only person she could imagine who would fight for it without being corruptible. Not a federal agent who could be reassigned or pressured. Not a journalist who could be threatened with litigation. Not another insider who owed something to someone. Just a woman who had been robbed, who had the most direct possible reason to want the truth and no existing obligation to protect anyone involved in hiding it. Nadia looked at Rosa's face in the photograph and thought, "Wherever you are, I hope you're watching." Then she started making a plan. The plan had 4 parts, and she worked them out on the back of the county registration printout because she wanted it on paper where she could see it whole. The first part was documentation. Dana had the financial records uploaded, but they needed to be duplicated beyond the single cloud folder. First thing in the morning, Nadia would drive to a FedEx office in Mobile, not Harrow's Point. Mobile, and print everything. Make 2 physical copies, and mail one set to Dana's home address, and one set to her own mother's address, and make it in a sealed envelope marked with a note not to open it unless Nadia said so. Paper copies in separate physical locations were harder to make disappear than digital files. She had learned enough from Rosa's notebook to understand that disappearance was a real risk. The second part was Rosa. She needed to know whether Rosa Calloway was alive. Not as a legal question, not as an abstract concern. She needed to know because if Rosa was alive, she was a witness. A witness who had already prepared a formal declaration, who had 9 years of institutional knowledge about CMG's operations, whose testimony would be the difference between a financial fraud case and a comprehensive criminal prosecution. And if Rosa was not alive, that fact was itself a piece of evidence, because the timing of her disappearance 11 months ago, coinciding with Marcus's final months at Harlow Maritime, would place her disappearance squarely within the window of CMG's most aggressive activity. She wrote Rosa Calloway's name on the printout and underlined it. She wrote underneath, "Last known, address Mobile." Find prior contacts. Anyone who knew her at CMG who wasn't implicated. The third part was Marcus. She had spent 2 weeks thinking of Marcus as a man who had chosen to leave her. She now understood that the picture was more complicated than that. He was a man who had been maneuvered into a position where disappearing was his only play, and who had taken it without fully understanding what kind of cage he was walking into. That did not excuse him. It did not rehabilitate 11 years of incremental betrayal. But it changed the calculation of what he was now: not a free man living comfortably on stolen money, but a man living under the permanent leverage of people who knew he was legally dead and could expose him at any moment. If Marcus could be reached, he might talk. He had very little to lose at this point and considerable personal interest in bringing down the people who had set him up. He had been used and discarded, and the only thing stopping him from being a cooperative witness was the fact that he didn't know anyone was looking for him. She wrote on the printout, "Find the Bahamas connection. Gregory Landers, when did he last travel? CMG board meeting records, are they public?" The fourth part was timing. She wrote it last because it was the one she had the least control over. She needed to move before Garrett Webb, or whoever sent him, found the keel plate cavity. Once that happened, the original documents were at risk. The cavity was well sealed, and she believed a casual search would miss it, but a systematic search by someone who knew what they were looking for was a different matter. She needed 48 hours of operational patience, as Dana had said. Then they would take everything they had: the photographs of Rosa's documents, the financial reconstruction Dana was building, the declaration, the account evidence, and submit it directly to the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit in Washington. Not the Mobile office. Not anyone in Alabama. She folded the printout and put it in her inside coat pocket. Outside, the marina had gone fully quiet. The slip lights reflected on the flat water in long orange stripes. A pelican had landed somewhere on the far dock, and she could hear it settling its wings, the soft ruffle of feathers, then silence. She thought about something Rosa had written in the notebook, in one of the later entries from the last year before her disappearance. It was a short passage, written in the margins of a page already full of account numbers, as if she had run out of space and written it anyway because it needed to be said somewhere. I have been careful for so long that I've forgotten what it feels like not to be. But careful is not the same as safe. And being careful alone is not enough. I need someone on the other end of this. Someone who doesn't owe anything to anyone involved. I keep thinking about his wife. She had been thinking about Nadia for a long time before she sealed that envelope. Nadia took out her phone and looked at the photograph one more time before she put it away. Rosa's composed expression, the camera held steady, the man with his back half-turned looking out at the water, the port of mobile behind them. Rosa's hand, just visible at the edge of the frame, slightly blurred. She had been holding something, Nadia now noticed. A phone, maybe, or a small notebook. Documenting even in that moment. Still gathering, still building the case. There was something else in the photograph Nadia had not paid enough attention to before. On the building visible at the right edge of the frame, the one Dana had identified as consistent with CMG's birth area, there was a partial sign. She had noticed it before but assumed it was CMG's signage. She zoomed in now on the photograph with her phone's magnification. The sign read, Meridian, and then the frame cut off. Meridian. Not Coastal Meridian Group. Just Meridian. She thought about the trust. The Meridian Cross Trust. The holding company Meridian Pacific Corporation. The board member G.W. Landers, whose entities all used some variation of the same root word. She thought about how Marcus had told her, years ago, that Coastal Meridian was in a different category. She had heard that as modesty, a small company owner acknowledging a larger competitor. She heard it differently now. He had been inside their structure. He had known exactly which category they occupied. She typed a quick message to Dana, one more thing to check. CMG's original corporate name. When they were first registered. What was the company called before they became Coastal Meridian Group? Then she put the phone down and lay back on the bunk she had set up in the wheelhouse, because she was not going back to sleeping in the forward berth until she knew for certain the boat was not being watched, and closed her eyes. She did not sleep right away. She lay in the dark and listened to the boat, and thought about what 48 hours looked like when someone already knew you were there. She thought about Garrett Webb's question about structural concerns. She thought about the phrase he had used, what appears to be deferred maintenance conceals, and how he had paused before finishing the sentence. He had paused because he was deciding in real time how specific to be. He had been told to find out what she knew. He had been probing, and she had given him nothing, but that itself was information. A woman who had just inherited a ruined estate and a worthless boat had no reason to be opaque with an insurance representative unless she had a reason to be opaque. She had shown her hand by not showing it, which meant the 48 hours Dana had asked for might be optimistic. She sat up. She went back to the chart table and looked at Rosa's photograph one more time and made a decision that was different from the plan she had just written down. The plan as written assumed that she could wait. That patience was available to her as a tool. It wasn't. Not anymore. She picked up her phone and called Dana. It rang twice and Dana answered, which meant she was still awake. The timeline needs to move up, Nadia said. How much? Whatever you have, I need it in shape to submit by tomorrow night. Not 48 hours. 24. A pause on the line. What happened? Nothing new. But I've been thinking about the investigator who showed up at the library. He was there to find out what I knew. He didn't get anything from me, but he'll report back that I wasn't cooperative. And whoever sent him will factor that in. She looked out the wheelhouse window at the dark water. If they've gotten as far as sending someone to the library, they're not going to wait many more days before they try something more direct. Nadia. Dana's voice was careful. Are you safe on that boat tonight? For tonight. But the situation is moving. I need us to be moving faster. She heard Dana exhale slowly. All right. I'll work through the night. Call me at 6. Call me sooner if you find the original company name. I will. They hung up. Nadia sat in the wheelhouse with the oil heater ticking beside her and the brass key in her palm, feeling its weight, feeling the specific shape of its teeth, thinking about the cavity in the hull and the 40 pages of Rosa's declaration and the $60 million that had moved over 9 years through a company whose real name she didn't yet know. She thought, Marcus, You have no idea what you left behind. Outside the Clara Jean, the channel buoy told in the dark, steady and patient, marking something invisible to anyone who didn't know where to look. Dana called at 5:47 in the morning, 13 minutes before Nadia had set her alarm. The sky outside the wheelhouse windows was still dark, the marina barely distinguishable from the water it sat on, and Nadia answered before the second ring with the particular alertness of someone who hadn't really slept. "I found it," Dana said. No preamble. No good morning. Nadia sat up straight on the bunk and pressed the phone against her ear. "Tell me." Coastal Meridian Group was incorporated in Alabama in 2007. Before that, the same principals operated under a different name. The original company was registered in 1999 as Meridian Cross Marine Services, LLC. Dana's voice was controlled, but something underneath it was not. "Nadia, the Meridian Cross Trust, the account Marcus used that name, is not a coincidence. It's a signature. Whoever named that trust named it after the original company." The channel buoy rang outside in the gray pre-dawn, 3 seconds between each toll. "Gregory Landers," Nadia said. "He was one of the founding principals of Meridian Cross Marine Services in 1999. He restructured it into Coastal Meridian Group in 2007, right around the time they started winning federal contracts. The name change was part of a rebranding designed to put distance between the new entity and certain audit findings from the original company's early years." Dana paused. "I found those audit findings. They're in the Alabama Secretary of State's archive filings from 2005. They reference irregularities in billing submitted to the Mobile Port Authority. The audit was closed without penalty because the company's legal counsel at the time arranged a private settlement with the Port Authority." "Who was the legal counsel?" "A firm out of Montgomery. One of the partners is now a federal bankruptcy judge." Nadia sat with that for a moment. The picture was fully formed now. Not a recent fraud, not an opportunistic scheme that Marcus had stumbled into. A structure that had been operating for 25 years, that had learned from an early brush with oversight how to make itself more invisible, that had absorbed Harlow Maritime and a dozen other small operators as disposable instruments, and that had grown large enough on federal contract money to make accountability feel like something that happened to other organizations. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. "How complete is the submission package?" Nadia asked. "It's ready. I was up until 4 building the final document. What I have is a 31-page financial analysis with citations to public records, cross-reference to the account documentation Rosa photographed, with a narrative timeline from 1999 to present. I've attached Rosa's declaration as Exhibit A and the account records as Exhibits B through F." Dana stopped. "It's good work, Nadia. I'm not saying that to reassure you. It's thorough. Any competent FBI financial analyst is going to see immediately what they're looking at." "Okay, send it." "I wanted to wait until you said go." "Go, Dana. Send it now." She heard the soft sound of a keyboard. Then, submitted. FBI Financial Crimes Unit, Washington Field Office. Encrypted submission portal. Case reference number is 74alpha92. I'm emailing that to you now and to a third address I trust. "Thank you." Nadia's voice came out steadier than she felt. "I mean it. Don't thank me yet. This could take days before anyone picks it up. Federal agency triub, I know. But it's in. That's what matters." She hung up and sat in the half-dark for a minute, breathing. Then she stood, made coffee, and began the morning. Her first stop was a FedEx location in Mobile, 35 miles west on Highway 90. She had printed everything at the library the day before, using the library's printer and paying in cash, and the 2 packets of documents were wrapped in brown paper in a tote bag she kept on the passenger seat beside her. She drove the Honda with the window cracked despite the cold because she needed the air on her face, needed the physical sensation of moving through the world to counteract the feeling of being watched that had settled over her since Garrett Webb's visit. She mailed both packets before 8 in the morning. One to Dana's home in Nashville, one to her mother's address in Macon with a note that said simply, "Mom, hold this sealed. Don't open it. I'll explain soon. Love, Nadia." She paid cash for both. She kept the tracking receipts. Back in her car in the parking lot, she called Carolyn Briggs. Carolyn answered on the second ring with the tone of a woman who had been managing other people's crises since before breakfast. "Nadia, I was wondering when I'd hear from you. I need to ask you something direct. All right. Philip just referred me to you. How well do you know Philip? A pause that lasted 3 seconds. In Nadia's experience, 3 seconds was too long for a simple professional question. We've worked on mutual cases over the years. Why? I need to know whether your representation of me has been fully independent of Harlow Maritime's interests. Another pause, shorter this time, and the quality of it was different, less calculated, more genuinely surprised. Nadia, I have no relationship with Harlow Maritime beyond the fact that Philip mentioned you needed representation. If you have a reason to believe otherwise, I want to hear it. She listened to Carolyn's voice carefully. She had spent 11 years listening to Marcus tell her things that were not quite true, and she had learned, finally, what the absence of guile sounds like. It sounds like small irritation and no hesitation. It sounds like this. I don't have a specific reason, Nadia said. I'm being careful. That's probably appropriate given your situation. A brief pause. Has something happened? Something is happening. I'm going to need you involved again, but not yet. I'll call you by end of week. She drove back east toward Harrow's Point on the highway, the December morning opening up around her, the pine flats on both sides silver with frost. Her phone had been quiet since Dana's call, which should have felt like calm, but felt instead like the specific silence that precedes weather. She was halfway back when it buzzed. Unknown number, Alabama area code. She answered. Is this Nadia Voss? The voice was a woman's, controlled, slightly hoarse, with the flat vowels of someone who had grown up in the Gulf Coast region and then spent years trying to sand them smooth. Who is this? My name is Rosa Calloway. Nadia pulled the car onto the shoulder of the highway and stopped. Her hands were completely still on the wheel. Are you there? Rosa asked. I'm here, Nadia said. I'm here. Where are you? Safe. I can't say where. I've been watching the marina for 2 weeks, since I found out the estate had been probated and you'd been assigned the boat. A short pause. I saw them go in yesterday. 2 men, not just one. I called the number you listed with the county clerk's office, but it was the attorney's number, and she didn't answer. You were there yesterday, while I was at the library. I saw the man leave before you got back. I waited to make sure they didn't go in a second time. Another pause, shorter than the others. Did they find it? No. The plate was undisturbed. A long exhale on the line. It was the sound of someone who had been holding a breath for 11 months. Did you read all of it? I read all of it. The declaration too? Every page. Then you know what it is. I know what it is, Rosa. We submitted it to the FBI this morning. Washington, Financial Crimes Unit, not mobile. She waited for a response. When it came, it was quiet. Good. Just that word. Then, there's something I need to tell you that isn't in the declaration. Tell me. I know where Marcus is. Nadia closed her eyes and opened them again. Outside, a line of slash pines ran along the road edge, their shadows crossing the asphalt in parallel stripes. How? Because Gregory Landers told him where to go. I was in the room when it happened. I wasn't supposed to be. I came back to the office for something I'd forgotten, and the conference room door wasn't fully closed, and I heard enough. Rosa's voice was careful and clear, the voice of a woman who had been recounting carefully observed facts for 9 years. Landers arranged a private villa rental in Nassau under a subsidiary name. He gave Marcus a phone, a cash account, and an identity document, a second passport, I don't know whose. He told him to stay in Nassau for a year, and then he would arrange permanent relocation. Did he tell Marcus why he should trust that arrangement? A brief silence. No. And Marcus didn't ask. That was always his failure. He was smart enough to build the structure, but not smart enough to question the people who handed it to him. A pause. Landers has no intention of relocating him. Marcus is a liability. He's living in a villa in Nassau on a calendar that has a hidden end date, and he has no idea. Nadia thought about Marcus in a rented villa, probably with a view of the water, probably with the kind of comfortable numbness that comes from knowing you've gotten away with something. She felt something she didn't expect. Not pity, exactly, but the recognition that the man she had married was not capable of seeing his own situation clearly. He never had been. Rosa, she said, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly. Go ahead. Why did you stay at CMG for 9 years after you understood what it was? You had documentation by your first year. You had enough to go to someone. Why did you keep going back? The silence on the line was longer this time. Then, Because I tried to leave in 2016 and I couldn't. Her voice didn't change register, but something in it settled into a different kind of honesty. I found a discrepancy in the billing system in my first 18 months. I started documenting it because I thought I might eventually take it to the audit committee. But I made the mistake of asking a colleague about one of the accounts, just a question, framed as a routine clarification, and within a week Landers called me into his office and explained very calmly that the firm had certain expectations of discretion from its senior financial staff, and that he knew I had a brother in Mobile with a contracting business, and that contracting businesses in this region depended significantly on relationships with Port Authority personnel. A pause. He didn't threaten me directly. He didn't have to. I understood exactly what he was saying. And after that you stayed and documented. I decided that if I was going to be trapped inside it, I was going to build the record. I was going to make it so complete, so undeniable, that when the moment came when I finally found someone I could trust to receive it, it would be enough to bring the whole structure down. Not just a piece of it. All of it. Her voice was steady. You're that person, Nadia. You don't owe anything to anyone in Harrow's Point. You have no reason to protect anyone involved. And you have the most direct legal standing of anyone I could have chosen. You're the defrauded surviving spouse of an instrument in a federal fraud. Your standing to bring this forward is ironclad. Nadia sat on the shoulder of the highway with the engine running and thought about 9 years of careful, frightened, determined documentation. She thought about Rosa sitting across the table from Gregory Landers while he explained quietly what discretion meant. She thought about the brass key, which was still in her coat pocket where she'd put it 3 days ago and hadn't stopped carrying. Are you safe right now? Nadia asked. Wherever you are. For now. I've been careful. I haven't used any account or identifier connected to my real name since I left. Do you have legal representation? Not yet. I'm going to call my attorney today. I want you to talk to her. She thought for a moment. And Rosa, whatever happens next, your brother's business. We'll make sure that's protected. Another silence on the line, and this one was different from all the ones before it. This one had texture, the particular texture of someone who has been carrying something alone for a long time and has just been told they don't have to carry it alone anymore. You don't have to do that, Rosa said. I know I don't. They made arrangements. Rosa would call back in 4 hours with a secure contact method Dana would set up. Nadia would call Carolyn Briggs and begin the process of establishing Rosa as a protected cooperative witness, which Carolyn would know how to handle regardless of her connection to Philip Jest. She pulled back onto the highway and drove. When she reached Harrow's Point, she did not go to the marina. She drove first to the diner on Camellia Street, where she ordered coffee and eggs, and she sat at a corner table and called Carolyn Briggs back and said, without much preamble, I have a cooperative witness with 9 years of inside documentation of a federal contract fraud. She needs representation and protective status. Can you handle that? Carolyn was quiet for a moment. Then, how large is the fraud? 60 million, documented. Likely more. Another pause, longer. I can handle that. Yes. Good. I'll have her contact you this afternoon. She finished her eggs, which were not very good, and paid in cash, and walked back to her car. She sat for a moment with her hands on the wheel, looking at the main street of Harrow's Point through the windshield, the hardware store, the insurance office, the county clerk's building at the far end of the block, and she thought about what the next hours looked like. The FBI submission was in. Rosa was alive and cooperative. The physical document copies were in transit to 2 separate addresses. The financial case was documented to a standard that Dana had called thorough. What happened next was largely out of her hands. She understood that. The government moved on its own timeline, with its own calculus of priority and resource allocation, and there was no guarantee that a financial crime submission, even a solid one, triggered immediate action. There could be days of review. There could be weeks. What she could control was the boat. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. She drove to the marina and walked down to slip 14. The Clara Jean was there, sitting in the gray midday light with its usual indifferent bulk. She climbed aboard and went directly to the forward hold and opened the keel plate cavity and looked at the packages on the shelves. Everything undisturbed. She had just swung the plate closed and was turning the key in the 4th bolt head when she heard footsteps on the dock. Not one set. 2. She came up from the hold through the forward hatch and into the galley and looked through the porthole at the dock. Two men were walking toward slip 14. One of them was Garrett Webb. The other was older, maybe 65, with the upright bearing of someone who had spent decades in institutional authority. Silver hair, dark coat, the particular confidence of a man who believed every room he entered would orient itself around him. She did not recognize the second man, but she recognized the type. She went up to the wheelhouse and stood to the side of the door, where she could see the dock without being visible from it, and she watched them reach the end of the slip and stop. Garrett Webb looked at the boat and then at the older man and said something she couldn't hear through the glass. The older man nodded and stepped forward onto the dock railing, examining the Clara Jean the way a buyer examines a property not with interest, but with assessment. He was calculating something. She thought, Gregory Landers. She had no evidence, only the particular intuition of someone who had been reading about a man for 2 days and now thought she recognized his posture. She took out her phone and called Dana. A man just showed up at the marina with Garrett Webb, she said quietly. Older, maybe 65, silver hair. Very comfortable with authority. I think it might be Landers. Stay inside the boat, Dana said immediately. Do not engage. I wasn't planning to. What do I do if they try to board? They have no legal right to board without your consent or a court order. If they attempt it, you call 911 immediately, and you also call Carolyn. If it's Landers, he's not going to call the police to board a boat in a public marina. No, he's going to try to buy you off or scare you off, and you need to let him try. Let him show his hand. You need to be able to document this interaction. I'll record it on my phone. She set the phone to record audio and put it in her breast pocket with the microphone end up. Then she went to the wheelhouse door and opened it and stepped out onto the deck. Both men looked up at her. Mrs. Harlow, Garrett Webb said. He had dropped the insurance pretense entirely. Ms. Voss, she said. The older man stepped forward. He had the face of someone who had been charming for so long that the charm had calcified into something that only resembled the original. My name is Gregory Landers. I believe you've been doing some research into the organization I chair. I've been doing a lot of reading, she said. I'm something of a reader. He smiled. It was a patient smile, the kind that had waited out inconveniences before. May I come aboard? You may not. The smile stayed. He was very practiced. I understand you've recently been through a difficult experience. Losing a spouse, even under complicated circumstances, and then discovering the financial situation. I imagine that's been devastating. It's been educational, she said. He looked at her steadily. I'd like to help resolve your financial situation. I'm aware of the outstanding debts, the liens, the damage to your credit profile. I'm in a position to make those problems disappear in exchange for a straightforward conversation about some documents that may have come into your possession through the estate. What documents? Records that were stored on this vessel by a former employee of mine. Those records belong to my organization, and I'd like them returned. Nadia leaned against the wheelhouse door frame and crossed her arms. She felt the brass key in her coat pocket, and she felt her phone recording in her breast pocket, and she felt the particular steadiness that comes when you have already done everything you can do and now you are simply standing in the result of it. Any records I've found on this vessel, she said clearly, belong to me as the legal owner of the vessel and everything aboard it as of the date of probate. My attorney has reviewed that question. Landers's patient smile shifted by a fraction, not breaking, just recalibrating. The vessel may be yours. The records predate your ownership and were placed here without the knowledge of the previous owner. That's an interesting legal theory. You're welcome to present it to a court. She looked at him. Is there anything else? A pause. For the first time, something moved behind his eyes that was not quite certainty. You should understand, he said, his voice dropping half a register, that the records you may have found represent a partial picture. An incomplete picture, taken out of context, could result in significant consequences for people who are entirely uninvolved in any wrongdoing. I'm sure the appropriate investigators will be thorough, she said. The pause this time was longer. She watched him process what she had just said. The word investigators, the past tense of will be, the distance in her voice that said she was not negotiating. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Garrett Webb. Then he looked back at her, and the patient smile was fully gone now. And what was underneath it was something harder and less carefully maintained. You have no idea what you're walking into, he said. I know exactly what I'm walking into, she said. I've been reading about it for a week. She went back inside and closed the wheelhouse door and stood with her back against it and listened to their footsteps on the dock, retreating. She let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. She called Dana and played her the recording. Dana was quiet for a moment after it ended. He just identified himself on tape and attempted to solicit the return of evidence in a federal fraud investigation. Her voice had a quality Nadia recognized as restrained excitement. That is a gift. I know. I'm uploading this recording to the FBI submission as a supplemental exhibit. Case reference 74-Alpha-92. The sound of Dana typing. Nadia, I think this just moved up someone's priority queue. She was right. The call came at 4:17 that afternoon. It was not the call Nadia had expected, which would have been a formal FBI intake interview scheduled for some future date. It was an agent named Weatherford, calling from a Washington number, whose voice had the particular briskness of someone who had cleared their afternoon schedule. Ms. Voss, I'm with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. We've received your submission, and we've had our forensic accounting team do an initial review. I need to ask you a few questions, and I need you to tell me the physical location of the original documents. The documents are secure, she said. They're on the boat. I can have my attorney present. That would be appropriate. I'd like to schedule a call with you and your attorney within the next 2 hours. We also need to discuss a related individual, Rosa Calloway. Do you have any information about her current whereabouts? She's safe. She's in contact with me and will be retaining separate counsel today. Agent Weatherford was quiet for 3 seconds. Ms. Voss, I'm going to be direct with you. The materials you submitted, both the financial analysis and the declaration, are consistent with a pattern of conduct we have been investigating through separate channels for over 2 years. Your submission connects several points that we have not previously been able to connect. We are moving quickly on this. She sat down on the bunk. How quickly? The warrant process has begun. I can't give you specific timelines, but I want you to understand that we consider the physical security of those original documents a priority. Can you ensure they remain where they are? Yes. Do not allow anyone aboard that vessel other than law enforcement with proper credentials. Do you understand? I understand. She called Carolyn immediately after. Carolyn had already heard from Rosa, had already spent 40 minutes on the phone with her, and was already prepared for the call with Weatherford. They spoke together, the three of them, Nadia, Carolyn, and Agent Weatherford, for an hour and 12 minutes that Nadia would later remember as the most concentrated hour of her life. She answered every question directly. She described where the documents were, in what sequence she had found them, what she had done with the copies. She provided the audio recording of Landers's dock conversation. When it was over, Weatherford said, "Stay on the boat tonight. Agents will arrive tomorrow morning to collect and formally document the evidence. Your cooperation is noted and appreciated." She hung up and sat in the wheelhouse in the early dark and felt the weight of the last 7 days pressing down on her from all directions. She thought about the sequence of it. The probate hearing and the $6 and the brass key. 3 nights sleeping in the helm seat reading Rosa's entries by flashlight. Dana's voice on the phone at 7 in the morning, flat and precise, laying out the architecture of a fraud she had already half suspected. Garrett Webb's practiced neutrality at the library table. Rosa's voice on the highway shoulder, saying, "You're that person, Nadia." She thought about Marcus in Nassau, sitting in a rented villa with a view of the water, checking a phone that Gregory Landers had given him, waiting for the relocation that was never going to come. She thought about whether she felt anything toward him that resembled what she used to feel, and found she did not. What she felt was cleaner than hatred and quieter than contempt. It was the specific emotion of someone who has looked at a locked room for years and finally understood that the room was always empty. 2 days later, 8 federal agents arrived at Harrow's Point Marina in 2 vehicles at 7 in the morning. Nadia was awake and had the coffee on. She took them down to the forward hold and opened the keel plate cavity herself, turning the brass key in the 4th bolt head, feeling the mechanism release, watching the plate swing open on its hidden hinge. The lead agent, a woman named Carver, stood beside Nadia and looked into the cavity with an expression that was professionally neutral and personally impressed. She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "This is some piece of engineering." Rosa Calloway owned the boat for 9 years before she transferred it, Nadia said. She had time to do it right. Agent Carver looked at her. "Where is Rosa Calloway now?" talking to her attorney. She'll make a formal statement at the time and place of your choosing. Carver nodded and turned to her team, and the process began the careful, methodical documentation of every package, every file, every sheet of paper in the cavity, each one photographed and bagged and labeled before removal. They worked for 3 hours. Nadia sat in the galley and watched through the hatch and drank 3 cups of coffee and didn't talk much. When they were done, Agent Carver came up to the galley and sat across from her and said, "I want to give you a realistic picture of what happens from here, because you've earned that." "Please," Nadia said. "We have enough to execute search warrants on Coastal Meridian Group's offices in Mobile, Biloxi, and Panama City. We have enough to freeze the financial entities documented in the Rosa Calloway Declaration. That will happen today." She paused. "Gregory Landers will be notified of an investigative interview request within the next 24 hours. Based on your recording of his dock conversation and the documentation we now hold, we expect that interview to proceed fairly quickly to an arrest." "And Marcus?" Carver met her eyes. "Your husband, your estranged husband, is a subject of interest. We are working with Bahamian authorities through Interpol channels. Given that he is living under a false identity and that the trust account connected to him has been funding the ongoing operation of a criminal enterprise, there is a strong basis for international cooperation. This will take longer than the domestic actions, but it will happen. I'm not asking for him to be prosecuted," Nadia said. "I'm asking for him to testify. He has direct knowledge of how CMG recruited mid-level operators. That's more useful than a conviction." Carver studied her for a moment. "You've thought about this?" "I've had a week of very long nights." The agent almost smiled. "We'll consider all options." She stood. "One more thing, Ms. Voss. The financial recovery aspect of this. As the defrauded surviving spouse of an individual who was used as an instrument in a federal fraud, your standing to recover assets from the proceeds of that fraud is substantial. I can't make you promises on behalf of federal forfeiture proceedings, but your attorney will advise you that cooperating witnesses and defrauded parties with documented losses typically receive priority. Consideration in asset distribution." Nadia looked at the now empty shelves behind the keel plate and thought about Rosa's 9 years of careful work. "The priority consideration should go to Rosa Calloway," she said. "She built that case. She spent 9 years building it. Whatever recovery there is, she should be at the front of the line." Carver looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "I'll note that in the file." The search warrants executed that afternoon. By evening, Coastal Meridian Group's offices in Mobile were sealed with federal evidence tape. Its principals notified of the investigation, its federal contracts suspended pending review by the relevant agencies. The story broke on the Alabama Regional News at 6 o'clock. A brief, careful report about a federal investigation into a Gulf Coast maritime logistics firm. By 10 that night, 3 national outlets had picked up the thread, led by Rosa's name in the declaration, which had been partially unsealed as part of the warrant application. By the following morning, Gregory Landers had retained counsel and was cooperating with the FBI in the specific, selective way that people with very good lawyers cooperate when they believe cooperation is preferable to the alternative. Donna Harlow called Nadia 2 days after the arrests began, and Nadia let it go to voicemail. The message said, in a voice that had lost its usual organized authority, "I don't know exactly what's happened, but I think I owe you an apology. I think I owe you more than that. Call me when you're ready." Nadia listened to it twice, then put the phone down. She wasn't ready yet. She would be, eventually, but not yet. Marcus was located in Nassau 11 days after the FBI submission, in a rented villa in the Cable Beach district, exactly where Rosa had said. He was found not by arrest. The Bahamian authorities preferred a different approach, given the complexity of the jurisdictional questions, but by a quiet meeting arranged by Interpol, in which a representative explained to him clearly the nature of the evidence that existed, the status of the accounts he had believed were his exit strategy, and the specific fact that Gregory Landers had, in the course of his cooperative interview with the FBI, confirmed Marcus's location and role in the enterprise within the first 4 hours of questioning. Marcus Harlow returned to the United States voluntarily, with counsel, 9 days after that meeting. He provided testimony. The testimony was extensive, detailed, and corroborated everything Rosa had documented about how CMG recruited and used regional operators. He described 3 other companies besides Harlow Maritime that had been structured the same way, 2 of which had principals who still didn't know they were being used. The prosecutors described his cooperation, in their formal filings, as material. Nadia did not speak to Marcus directly until 8 months after his return. The conversation happened in a lawyer's office in Mobile, with both their attorneys present, for the purpose of executing the divorce agreement. It was formal and brief and nothing like 11 years of shared mornings felt like, which was appropriate, she thought, because those mornings had not been what they seemed either. She signed the final papers on a Tuesday in late September, almost exactly a year after Marcus's boat had been found drifting in the Gulf. What she received through the legal process was not the fortune. Rosa had documented that recovery was complex, and the federal forfeiture proceedings would take years. But it was not nothing. The Meridian Cross Trust, once its beneficial ownership was established through the testimony and the documentary evidence, was subject to a civil recovery action that Carolyn Briggs pursued with the thoroughness of someone who had recently discovered a significant client. The trust held, at the time of its freezing, approximately $3 per million. After federal claims and legal costs, Nadia's portion of the recovery was $890,000, less than what was stolen. More than anyone in Harrow's Point had believed possible when she was standing on that dock, holding a $6 asset. Rosa Calloway's share, as Nadia had requested and Carolyn had formalized into the recovery agreement, was structured separately and substantially larger a recognition, in legal terms, of 9 years of work that no reasonable compensation metric could fully account for. The Harrow's Point Marina did not understand what had happened at first. The news covered CMG and the federal investigation without much local texture, and the connection between Coastal Meridian Group and the marina at Slip 14 was not immediately obvious to people who saw Nadia every morning carrying coffee down the dock. Earl Diggs asked her once, cautiously, whether it was true she'd found something in the tugboat, and she said yes, and he nodded and didn't ask for more. That was Earl's gift, knowing when not to push. The people who had said things to her at the diner and in the title company and on the steps of the county clerk's office did not apologize in any direct way. People rarely do. What happened instead was a quieter version of correction. Fewer turned shoulders when she walked in somewhere, fewer pauses in conversations when she entered a room. Brenda at the title company said hello to her in the grocery store with a warmth that had not been there before, which Nadia received with equal warmth and no comment. Donna Harlow's apology, when Nadia finally returned the call 6 weeks after it was left, was halting and imprecise in the way that apologies are when the person delivering them isn't entirely sure what they're apologizing for, but Nadia accepted it anyway. Donna had not been part of the fraud. She had been part of the smaller, more ordinary kind of harm, the kind that comes from assuming someone has less value than they do, and on that charge, most of the town of Harrow's Point was equally guilty, and Nadia had no particular interest in an extended reckoning. She was not, she discovered, a person who needed the satisfaction of watching others acknowledge they had been wrong about her. What she needed was what she had already built: the evidence submitted, the agents on the boat, Rosa's voice on the highway, Dana's commendation on the wall, the Gardner diesel turning over for the first time in 6 years. The rest was just weather. Rosa came to Harrow's Point once, in December, a full year after Nadia had found the notebook. She drove from the city where she had been staying, and she called ahead, and Nadia met her at the marina gate and walked her down Slip 14 to the Clara Jean. Rosa was shorter than Nadia had imagined from the photograph. She had dark red hair still, but cut differently, shorter now, and she had the particular quality of someone who has been frightened for a very long time and has recently started to relax, visible in the way she stood, slightly less braced than her voice had suggested, slightly more willing to look directly at things. She stood on the dock and looked at the Clara Jean for a long moment. "She looks the same," she said. "She looks the same," Nadia agreed. "I spent a lot of time on this boat over the years. After dark mostly. I'd take the bus to the marina and walk down and let myself on with a key Marcus never knew I had. The crew had a copy from before his time, and nobody ever changed the lock." Rosa paused. "I used to bring the printed records and seal them in the plastic and add them to the shelves, and then sit in the wheelhouse for a while before I left. I don't know exactly why. It just felt like the only place where what I was doing was real." "Come aboard," Nadia said. "I'll make coffee." They sat in the wheelhouse for 2 hours. Rosa told her things that weren't in the declaration, the early years at CMG before she understood what it was, the colleague who had been dismissed after asking the wrong question, the specific afternoon she had decided she was going to document everything or not go back at all. Nadia told her about the weeks after the probate hearing, the diner, Donna Harlow's visit, the night she sat on the wheelhouse floor reading the first notebook entry by flashlight. "I thought about you for years," Rosa said. "I'd see Marcus reference his wife in emails, and I'd think about what kind of person she was. Whether she knew. Whether she was complicit. I wasn't. I know. I figured that out the year before he disappeared. There was an email chain about the final stage of the transfers. He kept referencing that you didn't have access to the accounts anymore. The way he said it, it was clear he thought of your ignorance as an operational asset, as something useful to him." Rosa looked at her coffee. "That was when I decided if something happened to me, I wanted the documents to reach you specifically. You had the most to lose and the cleanest hands." They were quiet for a moment. Outside, the marina was its usual midday self, the sound of rigging moving in the wind, the slow creak of lines under tension, the particular flatness of December water. "What are you going to do?" Rosa asked. "Going forward." Nadia looked around the wheelhouse of the Clara Jean. The chart table, which had held a notebook and a photograph and a brass key. The helm with its wheel that still turned freely. The windows, which she had finally cleaned, and which now let in December light that fell across the old wood of the table in long pale rectangles. She had thought about this. She had thought about it in the way you think about things during 8 months of legal proceedings in the margins, in the early mornings, in the particular quiet that exists after you've made a large decision and are waiting for the world to catch up. "I'm keeping the boat," she said. "I'm going to have the engine rebuilt. Clyde at the marina has already looked at it. He says the Gardner diesel is salvageable if we replace the injectors and reseal the shaft. It'll take a few months." Rosa looked at her. "You're going to run her?" "I'd like to." She paused. "I was also thinking about what the Clara Jean actually is, besides a boat. She's a record. She's the physical place where 9 years of evidence was preserved until it was ready to be used." She looked at Rosa. "I don't think that's nothing. I don't think that should just become a weekend cruising boat." Rosa was quiet, waiting. "There's a legal aid organization in Mobile that works with financial fraud victims. Small businesses, families, people who've had their assets stripped through fraudulent contracts or predatory lending. They're underfunded. They have 3 attorneys and too many cases." Nadia set her coffee down. "I've been talking to them about establishing a fund. Not large, I don't have large, but enough to add a forensic accountant to their staff. Someone who can read financial structures the way you and Dana do." She met Rosa's eyes. "I'd like you to be involved, if you want to be. You have 9 years of experience reading exactly the kind of documentation that victimizes these people." Rosa looked at her for a long time. The December light moved across her face as a cloud shifted outside. "Yeah," she said quietly. "I'd like that." The Clara Jean got her new injectors in February. Clyde worked on the shaft seal through March. By April, the Gardner diesel turned over for the first time in 6 years, filling the engine room with the deep thrum of a working engine, smoke briefly pouring from the exhaust stack before clearing as the old machine found its rhythm. Nadia stood on the foredeck and felt the vibration of it through the deck plates under her feet, the boat alive around her in a way it hadn't been in years. Earl Diggs came down from the harbor master's office and stood on the dock and watched. "I'll be damned," he said. "You actually fixed her." "She was always fixable," Nadia said. "She just needed the right set of eyes." She took the Clara Jean out of Slip 14 on a Thursday in May, at low tide in the early morning, the channel markers cutting green and red through the pale light. She handled the helm herself, because Clyde had spent 2 hours in the wheelhouse with her, and she had paid attention the way she paid attention to things that mattered. The engine ran. The bow cut the flat water of the channel in a clean line. When she cleared the marina and the channel widened into open Gulf water, she cut the throttle back and let the boat drift for a moment. The sun was up and the water was the specific blue-green it becomes in spring, and the smell of salt and diesel and old steel was around her in a way she had come to find not unpleasant. She put her hand in her coat pocket and felt the brass key there, which she still carried, and thought about what it had opened. Not a cavity in a hull. That was part of it, but not the whole of it. It had opened a year of her life that she would not have chosen and could not have predicted, And on the other side of it, she was standing at the helm of a working boat in the Gulf of Mexico in the spring light, with Rosa Calloway building a second chapter in Mobile, and Dana back in Nashville with a federal commendation letter in a frame she had already decided where to hang, and Carolyn Briggs with a case that had expanded her practice in ways she would spend the next 3 years talking about, and Gregory Landers in the middle of a federal prosecution that the Alabama papers were covering with an enthusiasm proportional to how long he had seemed untouchable, and Marcus, somewhere in the middle of a cooperation agreement and a divorce decree, having lost the villa and the trust and the second passport and whatever he had believed was waiting for him, and having received in exchange the one thing Gregory Landers had not intended to give him, the specific mercy of people who understood that you could be both a participant in something terrible and a person who deserved a way out of it. She thought about $6. She thought about the number sitting in her head in the probate office, the smallest possible valuation, the judgment of everyone who looked at the Clara Jean and saw nothing worth having. She pushed the throttle forward, and the Gardner diesel answered, steady and deep, and the boat moved out into the Gulf under the morning sky. She did not have a particular destination. That was one of the things she had decided, along with keeping the boat, that she was done having other people's plans determine the direction she traveled. The Clara Jean could go where she chose. South toward the Barrier Islands. West toward the open water past the buoy line. East along the coast where the low marshland ran between the Pine Hills and the Gulf in a thin, green edge. She went east. She went at a pace that was unhurried, the engine running smooth and even, the wake spreading behind her in a long white V that caught the morning light, and then smooth flat as the water healed itself. Pelicans tracked parallel to her course for a while, working the surface, and she watched them do what they had always done, without any opinion of the boat or the woman running it or the year she had just come through. The Clara Jean was worth $6 on the day she inherited it. She had heard that number so many times in those first weeks from the marina manager, from Carolyn Briggs, from the court's matter-of-fact assessment, that it had settled into her the way cold settles into a room that's been empty too long. $6. The smallest possible acknowledgement that something exists. What she knew now was that the number had never measured the right thing. The surveyor had measured the hull and the engine and the condition of the deck fittings and the state of the paint. He had not measured what was behind a keel plate in the forward hold. He had not measured 9 years of a careful woman's witness. He had not measured what it was worth, to the right person, to be handed a space where the truth had been waiting. Some things are only worth what the right person brings to them. She kept going east until the town was out of sight behind her, and the water opened up and the sky went wide in every direction, and she stood at the helm of a working boat in the Gulf of Mexico and breathed salt air and thought about nothing in particular for the first time in a year. That was enough. That was exactly enough. Later, people would ask her, and people did ask. Once the story found its way into the regional press and eventually a longer feature in a national magazine, how she had known to look inside the boat. How she had known not to walk away from a $6 inheritance the way everyone in Harrow's Point expected her to. She never had a good answer for that, because the honest answer was that she hadn't known anything. She had known only that she had nothing left to protect by being cautious. When a person is left with nothing, the risk calculation changes entirely. There is nothing to lose by looking. There is no downside to opening a sealed envelope, to reading a stranger's notebook, to spending a cold night in a rusted wheelhouse reading 3 years of handwritten evidence by flashlight. The worst that could happen was that she would find nothing, and nothing was already what she had. What she told people, when they asked, was simpler. She said that she had learned to trust what other people dismissed. The boat was worth $6. The envelope was just an envelope. The notebook was just an old journal. Every piece of it had been assigned a value by people who had an interest in keeping her from looking too closely, and every piece of it had been wrong. She had stopped trusting other people's valuations of things. She had started looking for herself. That, she thought, was the only lesson worth keeping from a year that had taken almost everything and given back something she hadn't expected to find. Not a fortune, exactly, though there was that too, but something quieter and more durable. The specific knowledge that she was the kind of person who kept going, who read the whole notebook, who called her sister at midnight, who stood on the deck of a boat she owned and looked a powerful man in the eye and told him no. She had not known she was that person before. Marcus had not known it either, which was perhaps the most complete failure of his judgment in a year that contained many failures of judgment. She knew it now. The Clara Jean pushed east through the May water, and Nadia stood at the helm with her hand on the wheel, and the sun came up fully over the low line of the coast, and the gulf opened up ahead of her, wide and unhurried, indifferent and beautiful, going as far as the eye could reach, and then farther. The Callaway Voss Fund opened its doors on the first Tuesday of October, in a two-room office on St. Louis Street in Mobile, with a shared conference table and a coffee maker that Rosa had brought from her apartment. The legal aid organization that housed it had given them the space rent-free for the first year in exchange for a donation to their operating costs, an arrangement Nadia had negotiated herself, which surprised Carolyn Briggs and no one who had watched her negotiate anything in the preceding 12 months. Rosa's official title was Senior Financial Analyst. She took it seriously in the way she took everything seriously, which was quietly and without ceremony. On the third day, a woman came in with a cardboard box of documents, a shrimping family out of Bayou La Batterie, whose fuel supplier had been systematically overbilling for 4 years through a contract that nobody had read closely enough. Rosa sat with her for 2 hours and went through every invoice, and when she was done, she turned to the woman and said, "You're owed about $42,000. The woman started crying before she could say anything back. That was the first case. There were 11 more by December. Dana came down from Nashville in November, the first time she had visited the boat. She stood in the forward hold with her hands on her hips and looked at the keel plate, which still swung open on its hidden hinge, because Nadia had decided not to seal it permanently and was quiet for a long time. She built this herself? Dana asked. Rosa thinks she had a welder she trusted. The hinge work is too clean for a single person. Dana pressed her palm flat against the plate and pushed it open, peering into the empty cavity with the rubberized shelving and the careful waterproof lining. I spent 3 months looking at the documents that came out of this space, she said. It's strange to see where they lived. Rosa said it always felt like the only place where what she was doing was real. Dana pulled the plate closed again and listened to the latch mechanism engage. I want to meet her. She's coming to dinner Friday. They ate on the boat, the 3 of them, because the Clara Jean had a galley table that fit 4 if nobody stretched their arms, and because it was the right place for that particular meal. Rosa brought red wine, and Dana brought a pie from a bakery in Harrows Point that turned out to be excellent, and they sat together in the galley for 3 hours while the marina went quiet around them, and the tide came in, and the boat rose almost imperceptibly in the dark water of the slip. They talked about the fund. They talked about the shrimping family and 2 other cases that Rosa had already flagged as strong candidates for civil recovery. Dana described the FBI commendation letter, which she had received 6 weeks after the initial submission and which noted, in the careful formal language of federal acknowledgement, that the documentary evidence provided had materially advanced an ongoing investigation and resulted in asset seizures significantly exceeding initial projections. The total seizure, across all the CMG entities and connected offshore accounts, had reached $93 million. Nadia's recovery and Rosa's recovery together came to less than 2% of that number, which was the particular arithmetic of federal forfeiture proceedings structured for the government's benefit first, with the victims of the fraud receiving what was negotiated and nothing more. Neither of them said the number 93 million felt fair. Neither of them said it felt unfair either. What it felt like was real, which was different from both. At some point in the evening, Dana asked Nadia what she had done with the brass key. Nadia reached into the pocket of her flannel shirt and set it on the galley table between them. It sat there in the soft light of the overhead lamp, small and plain, the tarnish worn off the grip from a year of being turned over in her fingers. I haven't decided, she said. Rosa looked at it. I used to have a copy of that key, she said. I lost it somewhere between Mobile and wherever I ended up. I was glad, actually. It felt right that I shouldn't have it anymore. Nadia picked it up. The weight of it was so familiar by now that she felt its absence when she wasn't holding it more than she felt its presence when she was. She thought about the cavity in the hull. Empty now, the shelves bare, the rubberized lining still intact and dry after everything. She had left the hinge mechanism functional because she hadn't known what else to do with it, and because dismantling something that had been built with that much care felt like the wrong kind of destruction. She had been thinking, in the weeks before Dana's visit, about what that space could hold going forward. Not documents, Not evidence. Not someone else's 9 years of frightened testimony. Something chosen, something placed there deliberately. She hadn't landed on what yet. "I think I'll know when I know," she said, and set the key back on the table, and Rosa poured the last of the wine, and outside the slip light made its orange stripe across the water, and the Clara Jean held them all, steady on the tide, worth whatever the right person decided to bring to her. 3 weeks after Dana went back to Nashville, a letter arrived at the fund's St. Louis Street office addressed to Rosa, no return address, postmarked from a city in Florida neither of them had a connection to. Inside was a single index card with 6 words written on it in handwriting that Rosa identified immediately. "Glad you found the right one." Nothing else. No signature, though none was needed. Rosa brought it to the boat on a Saturday morning and set it on the chart table. They looked at it together for a moment without speaking. Then Nadia went down to the forward hold and opened the keel plate and placed the index card on the lowest shelf, in the spot where the notebook had been. She closed the plate and turned the key and listened to the mechanism engage. That was what the space was for. Not storage. Not evidence. Just this, the small, plain record of the things that had mattered, held somewhere safe until it was time to let them go. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.